Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar that is called Feminist Ethics of Care and the Doctor-Woman Medical Encounter, What Love Has to Do with It. This event is organized by the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights in Rome, organized in collaboration with Ateneo Pontificio Regina Apostolorum University, University of Princeton, and European University of Rome. One housekeeping announcement before we start. If you have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A section, as well as the name of the academic your question is directed to, so we know who to ask in the Q&A session. Before each session, we'll introduce the theme and the first speaker. And then we will move on to Q&A, and we'll also announce the breaks in between the sessions. And now I can give the words to Dr. De Campos-Rudinsky.
Thank you, Milena, for this introduction. Good morning and welcome to this webinar on Feminist Ethics of Care and the Doctor-Woman Medical Encounter, where we'll be discussing what it means to love women in the medical context. So as Milena said, I am Tana De Campos. I'm an assistant professor of law at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, from where I'm speaking today. And I'm also a Fung Fellow in Princeton. And this event is organized by the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights and co-sponsored by the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies. So we would like to thank these institutions for their support. One of the purpose of today's webinar is also to launch our research group on women's equity and dignity in healthcare, which I lead with my dear friend Caterina Milo. And the mission of this research group is to investigate and disseminate the particular vocation of women in the workplace, in the family, in politics, in education, in society, in their homes, in healthcare. So this particular vocation of women is what has been called the feminine genius. And we seek to further develop this concept, especially as it applies to questions of healthcare, bioethics, and human rights. And this is what we are here for today. So to give us some background information about today's webinar, I give the floor now to Caterina Milo, who is a PhD candidate at Durham Law School, and whose important work looks at the theme of informed consent to abortion. Caterina.
Thank you, Milan and Tana, for the nice introduction. And as Tana said, I have the pleasure to host this event, which launches also the research group Dignity and Equity in Women's Health Issues. And just a couple of recap on today's webinar. So today's webinar is structured around 3 sessions. We're going to have basically speakers are going to look at what does it mean to love women in a medical context, why law, ethics, and medical practice should reflect upon this, and how this can be translated into medical practice. With Tana and with the UNESCO, we have been thinking and brainstorming this for a while, and we think that this is a timely topic and these are timely questions. So we very much look forward to hearing what all the speakers that we're going to have today are going to say about this topic. So I don't want to spoil anything about their reflections. So without further to say, I just want to leave the floor to Professor Alberto Garcia, the director of the UNESCO Chair in Rome. And I'm very glad that you are with us today. To you, Alberto. You're muted. Alberto, sorry, you're muted.
Welcome to this webinar on feminist care ethics. And welcome to the first activity, or the first endeavor that the group of study on dignity and equity in women's health issues are organizing and launching this new project regarding ethics, bioethics, and women. Our UNESCO chair in bioethics and human rights was established 12 years ago in Rome in 2 universities, Regina Apostolorum University and Università Europea di Roma. And from the very beginning, we thought about this as one of the areas of interest of the UNESCO chair, thinking about the present and the future of bioethics and human rights. In the past, we have already activated groups relating topics like neuroscience and neurobioethics, topics and areas related to the dialogue in between bioethics, multiculturalism and religion, and bioethics and art is the third area of interest. And today you are participating in the birth of this important and sensitive area, moving in the analysis of how women and the feminist approach to bioethics can help to improve the common good of the humanity. Take a look that 70% of the health working force in the world during this pandemic of COVID, 70% are women. So I think we should analyze and be responsive to ensure their particular needs and human rights at stake when practicing as health professionals, and therefore supporting women health professional vocation to go beyond justice. I am a lawyer by training, and this is not a matter of justice, it's how we can help and support them to go beyond justice and duties, providing care and love for the good of the patients. I think this might foster male health professionals to learn and to do so, avoiding stereotypes and biased gender conflict. So visiting sometimes the United States, it's common to use this expression that means losers. And sometimes people think women are losers, and I don't think they are. We have to learn from them. We have to learn how women, this genius, this talent, can help to the professionals of health, but to the world. That's why this webinar, I think, is going to analyze in a very interesting way this kind of contribution. So I'm very, very happy to participate in the organization of this seminar. I want also to thank the Fund Global Fellows Program at Princeton supporting the initiative, and above all, the important and relevant speakers participating in this seminar from well-known universities around the world. We are honored to welcome you, and I hope you will enjoy this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Garcia. So now we can kick off with the first session. The title of the session is Woman-Centered Ethics of Care. And our very first speaker will be Dr. Marta Rodriguez with her presentation on what does woman's body reveal on care and love. Dr. Marta Rodriguez is an academic and research coordinator for the Institute of Women's Studies at the Athenaeum Pontificium Regina Apostolorum in Rome. She's a member of the editorial board of Women, Church, World, and she has vastly published on the topics of women, gender, and the role of women within the Catholic Church. Dr. Rodriguez, you have the word.
Thank you very much, Milena. I hope I will be able to explain myself in my bad English with a very strong Spanish accent. It's also, I do have that Spanish accent also when I speak Italian, so there's no way to run away from it. But I hope that the effort of trying to understand me will keep you awake, even if we have just had lunch, I think most of us. So I hope it will keep you at least doing some effort that will keep us all awake. So I'll start my presentation by putting some questions. Is it possible to talk about women's approach to care? Before they were talking about a feminine genius. If we have a feminine genius, if we have such an approach, how can we know that it's not a consequence of culture? And if there's a need of a new culture of care in medical field, what is the women's contribution to that culture? Because I think we need to take into account that talking about the relationship between women and care requires considering that that relationship has been justly, I think, put into discussion in recent years. And why I say justly, because I think we have almost left behind that conception that was too much essentialistic, too much full of stereotypes of men and women, that had divided and had assigned very static roles and functions to men and women. So the world of technology and culture was entrusted to men and care to women. And I think that model doesn't work anymore. It hasn't resisted criticism. So is it possible, now we see the seriousness of the question, no, of this panel. Is it possible to talk about a women's approach to care and how and what comes then before culture? So that leads me to present you the order of the ideas I want to share with you. I'd like to start with our body, because I think it's the only thing that we can be sure that it comes before culture. So I'll try to share with you some reflections on how our body can be understood as a way of being. Then I'll try to see what does women's bodies say on these issues, and then some applications. Okay, this is the program, but I'll be quite quick. So the first is our body, no? And I'd like to use the thought of Sartre, which because I think he has a very interesting concept that can be helpful for us, because he talks about the psychical body. He has this concept, psychical body. And for him, our body is like at the starting point of any experience. So the body is like the necessary condition of action and of being. And it does impose some specific limits that he recognizes that they are like existential bounds. But those bounds and those limits also make freedom possible. So he says, and this I think is very interesting, he says, consciousness exists its body. I hope my English, yeah, it's written, so it's easier to understand it. So that means that our body is like a conscious structure of our consciousness. So that means that for Sartre, a human body belongs to what he calls the non-thetic consciousness. And what does it mean, non-thetic? For him, in his language, it means before every act of reflection. Before any act of reflections, it's this non-thetic consciousness, okay? So the body then is like a way of being in the world. And he does speak also, and I think this is very interesting, of an original affectivity that comes because of our body. And again, he speaks about a non-thetic affectivity, so before reflection, okay? Before the act of thinking. Before any constituted affectivity, we have this original affectivity. I'm sorry, we have just had lunch, and I'm tiring you with philosophical concepts, but I think they are going to be useful for a reflection. So he thinks that our experience is always embodied, no? And that every act of our consciousness or affectivity is like anchored in our body, okay? So now I think we could add, and this is beyond Sartre, a reflection, that in some way, consciousness and affectivity are modeled in our body. And they are not detachable from our body. They are not our body, but they are modeled in our body. No? So from these concepts, I think we can say that our body gives us a way of being in the world. And this implies, I think, two things. One is a relational modality, and the other is an existential orientation. So I'm going to say something very brief about both. The relational modality, this is what the feminists of difference have been reflecting a lot on. In concrete, Luce Irigaray, she speaks about the relational difference. And this difference is not shouldn't be identified with or reduced to specific roles, specific characteristics. We have already said that these rigid models don't work anymore, but she says that because of our body, we can see that it's not the same to be born woman from a woman or man from a woman. This is a relational difference. No? Or she says also, it's not the same to make love inside our body or outside our body, or generating life inside our body or outside. Those are strong differences that mark our bodies, and then also we can say our way of being in the world. And then our body gives us also what I call an existential orientation, which means like an orientation towards sense and meaning, okay? And I want to stress that this comes before any act of reflection. So it comes also before any cultural interpretation or influence. It comes before culture, okay? So let's go now to the second point, that is to see what does women's body tell about care, no? And I wanna consider pregnancy. And my focus in pregnancy is just a method, because if we have affirmed that our body gives us like this way of being in the world, so if we analyze the only relation that is exclusive for women, I think it will help us to capture some aspects of this relational modality that I have been speaking about. So, and since we have said with Sartre that this is before culture, before any personal act, then this way of being in the world will characterize every woman, mother or not, actual mother or not, okay? Because it comes because of our body, not because of our acts, okay, or experiences. So this relationship that we have during pregnancy has been described as a symbiosis, no? And it entails a reciprocal exchange that leaves a mark in the body and the psyche of both, no? The child and the mother, and remains forever. It's a two-way relationship, no? And mother and child are both passive and active at the same time. So it's beautiful to see how the embryo is in some way like the artifact of his future, and he's benefiting his mother by protecting her and even healing some wounds that with the stem cells that he has in the umbilical cord. So what does a special and very particular relationship reveal of humankind? I think that analyzing this experience, we see that openness to the other is not an addition to identity, but is an integral part of it. The openness to the other is not an addition, but is an integral part of identity. So here we discover the what we can call the relational identity that shows us that identity and alterity are not opposed, but affirm each other. And now while we are very far from Sartre, because he sees the relationships between people in a dialectic manner, okay? So we can see here like the notion of individual does not imply autonomy understood as self-sufficiency, because we are all human beings. We are dependent on our origin, and we are also dependent on the development of our identity. And we see in this symbiosis how women's body can react and respond to all the needs of the embryo with this very sophisticated communication between mother and child that speaks, and this is what I want to stress, is it speaks about the receptivity of the women's body to welcome, to nurture, and to affirm life. We have that receptivity to welcome, nurture, and affirm life. And this possibility, I think it has to have some kind of consequence in our way of being that we have been talking about. No? So, and this child is sending a message to the immune system of the mother that says, I am not you, but I am part of you. And this is a very strong message. I am not you, but I'm part of you. I think we have to listen to that message to many of our neighbors, coming also from many of our neighbors. Women, and another aspect that I want to stress, women cannot control the process of gestation. No? Well, if we refuse it, even unconsciously, maybe our body can become hostile to the new life. But the thing is that we cannot make things happen faster or in a different way. We just must let the process happen. It has to happen. No? And this is something also that I think it speaks about our way of being in the world, because maybe it could be the origin of that relational modality that we have that enables us to capture some aspects that came from our control in a process, for example. No? The things that we can't control, the need of time, subjective aspects, in events or situations that we cannot control and that we just have to accept. We get to see those aspects, no? And it doesn't mean that women are passive, no? Because accepting and receiving the rhythm of a process and the rhythm of the other can become sometimes a very strong and courageous form of action. No? We have to take into account, and I finish with this third point, that human motherhood is rooted in biology, but it radically transcends biology. No? Because our body gives us a way of being in the world, but this general orientation needs to be modeled by freedom. It's very beautiful what Graciela Morcellini says, that pregnancy implies an interruption of the women's self-understanding. And it's not just a change of plans, but a change of identity, because in this stage, the freedom, and this is what I want to underline, freedom of the mother is challenged by a call to not be anymore the center of herself. And this will reposition her in all her relationships, no? But this is the work of freedom, not the work of biology, the work of freedom. So biology gives us an orientation, but then freedom has to take it and to model that, okay? So this potentiality that we have remains silent without personal engagement in it that happens in a very concrete existence, okay? So I have 5 minutes left for my fourth point. It's gonna work. Some applications to care. So what does all this reveal from of the contribution of women to care and to culture, okay? I'd say 3 things at least. No, the first thing that I think we can learn from this is that self-autonomy begins with dependency and vulnerability, because we recognize that we are all interdependent, but we tend to think that this interdependence is like a cooperation between independent person, no? And maybe what we have to put into question is the idea of autonomy that lies behind this, no? Because I think we all realize right now that we are living a planetary pandemic that has demonstrated our vulnerability, no? As the Pope reminded us last 27th of March, and I think everybody listened to that message from every religion. And he said, the storm has exposed our vulnerability and uncovered those false and superfluous certainties. No? We are all in the same boat. Everything is interconnected. No? So, and touching our own vulnerability has opened our eyes to see how true is that we are living in a throwaway culture. And the event of gestation reminds us that interdependence begins and usually ends with dependence. So we could transform our paradigm and see that equality does not necessarily come from autonomy or self-sufficiency, but from the recognition of an original vulnerability. And this is very clear on the receptivity of the mother. So how would be a culture if it was built on the awareness that we are all vulnerable and interdependent. Then the second application that I see is that to receive the other doesn't bring death, but life. But to receive the other doesn't bring death, but life. Because the station, I think, is the best example of how welcoming the most vulnerable does not impoverish, but it enriches us, okay? And this implies, again, a new paradigm that pushes us beyond our comfort zone and to enter into the paradigm of graciousness. Graciousness. Oh my goodness. Have I written that? No. So I hope you understand. Graciousness. Okay. Because without that, I think our relations can be very economic relations, like the Pope says, no, a form of commerce, no, that we can't give anything if we are not hoping and something in return. No? And today we need, it's an urgent need to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And I'm not talking now about volunteer action or just doing something good for free. I think we need to see now that our social and economic system is not sustainable anymore, and it needs to change from its very basis. No? So as some religion leaders are warning us after the pandemic, we can't just go back to normal because we are living on a technocratic paradigm, and we need to change that paradigm, okay? And then the third application is precisely the paradigm of care opposed to the paradigm of dominion and utilitarianism. No? And I'll just say something that Scheller says, this anthropologist. He says that there's an affective power in women that exceeds the simple maternal instincts and that overflows in that field that today we call ecology. So if this is so, I think women have a particular contribution to do to the transformation of this paradigm of dominion and utilitarianism to the paradigm of care. So, and we need to change our approach to reality and do not consider ourselves anymore like the absolute masters of our own lives and of all that exists, but caregivers of that. So my conclusions would be that we can speak about a women's approach to care. I think we can do that. And this approach has to do with our way of being that is marked by our body. And this approach is very much needed to renew the culture of care in medical field, but not only in medical field. So my conclusion, I'm sorry to report a quote that it comes from so far, but I think it was something prophetic and is very much needed today. So it is part of the message of Paul Dexys after the council. And I want to read just what is in bold. No? It says, at the moment when the human race is undergoing so deep a transformation, and in this moment in which we are living such a crisis, women can do so much to aid mankind in not falling. This is my desire, and this is what I see that could come from it. Thank you very much. I didn't share my presentation. Oh. I did have a presentation that I haven't seen looking, and you haven't said so. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
I have it here, and you haven't seen it. That's sad. Bye.
That's okay. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. For those of you watching us, if there are any questions that you have for Dr. Rodriguez or any of the other following speakers, please submit them through Q&A function of the Zoom webinar, and please include the name of the academic your question is directed to, and we'll get back to those questions at the end of the session. Our next speaker is Professor Charles Foster. He's a fellow of Green Templeton College, a member of the Oxford Law faculty, and senior research associate at the U. Hiro Institute for Practical Ethics within the Faculty of Philosophy. And he's a research associate at the Ethox Center and the Helox Center, both within the Faculty of Medicine. His main areas of research interest are medical law and ethics. And his presentation today is titled "To Love Her is to Know Her, the Biology and Ethics of Relationality." Professor Foster, you have the word.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you. It's a tremendously exciting subject, and I'm delighted to contribute. It's very commonly and rightly observed that the quality of our conclusions in medical law and ethics can be no better than the quality of the science which underlies those conclusions. So if you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. We often talk in law and ethics about relationality, and so it's worth looking at what the science says. So what I'm going to do is look very briefly at what we know about the selective pressures that have molded our capacity for relationship to the shape that it is now, and about what all that should mean for medical consultations, particularly in the context of pregnancy. The starting point is that there's not much space inside our skulls. Our skulls are prime real estate, and brains are very metabolically expensive. They comprise about 2% of our body weight, but they consume about 20% of the energy. For weight, brain tissue needs about 20 times more energy than muscle does. And the brain has to do a lot of work to justify that discrepancy. It does that work. The most sophisticated brain work there is relationship. And so it's unsurprising that brain size correlates well with the number of flourishing relationships that you can sustain. And it correlates well too with the depth of our relationships. So polygamous animals who invest relatively little in each relationship have, by and large, correspondingly smaller brains than monogamous animals. In primates, there's a very neat straight line correlation between the size of the frontal lobes and the size of the group in which those primates are typically found. So if you know the size of the frontal lobes, you can predict accurately the group size. So reading the expected group size off the graph for creatures with human-sized frontal lobes, you get to a group size of 150. That's known as Dunbar's number, after Robin Dunbar, the Oxford evolutionary scientist and psychologist. Once you know about Dunbar's number, you'll see it everywhere. So it is roughly the size of military companies across history and across the world. It's the size of English villages from the Neolithic to the 18th century. After the 18th century, things started going wrong. It's the size of Amish parishes. It's the size of the larger regional clusterings of hunter-gatherers throughout the world. It's the average number of Facebook friends, and also it's the size of really functional commercial groupings. So a company like Gore-Tex caps the number of its employees in each factory at 200. Why? Because human communities work best if everyone knows everyone else sufficiently and so can trust them. So there's a limit which is imposed by the size of your brain on how many people one can know sufficiently. Reciprocity and trust are much more efficient societal and commercial lubricants than status or financial reward. Primates are special, and human primates are particularly special. 40% of the total brain volume of the average mammal is neocortex. That's the modern higher level processing part, which is plastered over the outside. And that figure drops to about 10% for shrew-like mammals, and it rises to about 50% for non-human primates and soars up to 80% for humans. We think and we relate much more intensely than shrews, or at least we can. We came of age as a species on the East African plains, and a big group size makes a lot of evolutionary sense for primates there, because if more eyes are watching, there's a bigger chance of seeing predators. And if there are more teeth, there's a bigger chance of seeing those predators off. But big group size is costly as well. It's stressful. And stress has important biological effects, particularly on females. It stops them ovulating. So typically in primate groups, the 10th ranking females, who are more stressed than the higher status animals, are usually infertile. The answer to big, stressful group size, for us, just as well as for baboons, is to gather around you a group of real friends, your best friends, friends that you know and who know you. But it follows from Dunbar's number that we can't have an infinite number of reliable friends. Friendships need neurological processing power, and so the size of our brains limits the number of real friendships, and friendships need time and work. In non-human primate communities, friendships are mainly pursued and cemented through grooming, and that grooming takes up far more time than is necessary for hygiene. It's not all about fleas and lice. Evolution's been very cunning. It's made it very pleasurable to be groomed because grooming triggers some neurons, which are called C afferent fibers, that respond only to the light stroking of hairy skin. And they cause a massive release of naturally occurring opiates, which are called endorphins. They make us feel relaxed and happy and close to those who are near us when we have that opiate high. So it's a long time, as you can see, since I went to have a serious haircut, but I'm told, although I can't remember it myself, that having a haircut, having your hair done, is a very pleasurable experience. Palestinian Arabs have a special word, naiman, which expresses the particular feeling of well-being that comes after you've had a haircut. And that's a feeling of well-being, which is produced by endorphins, and it has been used very potently by evolution to bond communities together. So friends who are close enough to groom you can change your mood and your biology. If you're an East African female baboon, you are likely to have more surviving offspring if you've got plenty of grooming partners. We can see the power of opiates in unhappier contexts too. So if you block opiates chemically, you create an appetite for grooming. If you flood the receptors with opiates, you'll want to be left alone. So think about the self-imposed social isolation of heroin addicts after they've had a fix. You'd expect the amount of time that primates spend grooming to be a function of group size. So you'd expect the bigger the group, the longer the grooming time, and up to a point. It is, but only up to a point, because you can't spend all day grooming. You've got to eat, you've got to watch out for leopards, you've got to woo your mates, and you've got to sleep. So it's just not feasible to groom for more than about a fifth of the day. Otherwise you start going downhill and start getting eaten by leopards. So there's a problem. And here's where it starts to get really interesting. So remember that human Dunbar number of 150. To maintain a group of that size simply by grooming, we'd have to groom for about 43% of our time. We can't do that. Something else has to make up the shortfall, and other things have made up the shortfall. We've developed a number of other endorphin releasing and bond forming strategies that don't involve touching. They are, and Robin Dunbar suggests that they arrived in this order: laughter, wordless singing and dancing, language, and ritual and religion and story. I'm going to focus for a couple of minutes on language. There are several reasons for that. The main one is that language is likely to be more prominent in the medical consultation than laughter, singing, dancing, or religious ritual. Unfortunately, it'd be much more interesting to go to the doctor if it weren't the case. Language, as we all know, is tremendously powerful. It can create and curate alliances. It can formulate and test scenarios. It's also central to the way we perceive ourselves. We articulate ourselves to ourselves, just as we construct everything else in the world, in linguistic propositions. We use personal pronouns all the time, and we mean something by them. The self-definition might be accurate. Say, in my case, I'm a fat, bald, middle-aged man, or it might not be. I am a dazzling Adonis, but at least it gives us an idea of part of what we think of ourselves. And if I know what I am, as disclosed by the account I give in language to myself of myself, I will be able better to give myself to others. And so when language first flowered, probably in the Upper Paleolithic, 35 or 40,000 years ago or earlier, it might have allowed a new form of relationship. It may too, and very importantly, have enabled us to think ourselves into others' positions. or at least allowed us to upgrade the ability to think ourselves into others' positions that we had before we had language. And that's the view of many mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists, led by Robin Dunbar again and Clive Gamble. And the argument is a simple one, and it goes something like this: by using language, I explicate myself and the rest of the world. By using language, you explicate yourself and the rest of the world. Because we're using the same medium to explicate ourselves and the world, I can have a well-informed guess about what you are thinking about yourself and about the rest of the world. So we're using a common linguistic currency. We interpret the world to ourselves using that common currency, and therefore we can understand something about what's going on in the minds of others. So the ability to think oneself into another's position is variously described.
Charles, sorry for interrupting you. Could you move your camera so we can see you better? That's perfect.
Is that any better?
Yes, this is perfect.
Okay, great. The ability to think oneself into another's position is variously described. I'm going to talk loosely and more or less interchangeably about theory of mind and intentionality. As you all know, theory of mind is the social cognitive ability to explain and predict other people's actions in terms of the underlying mental states, such as beliefs or intentions or feelings. So if someone reaches towards a cup of tea, it's my theory of mind which reads in that action an intention to drink tea, rather than simply understanding it in terms of the muscle action and the mechanics of lifting up the cup of tea. It's my theory of mind that allows me to penetrate beneath literal meanings, for example, to recognize irony. And for successful social interaction, we need theory of mind. It's impaired in lots of neuropsychiatric disorders, which are characterized by a compromised ability to read social situations. We all know that people vary significantly in their ability to read the intentions of others, hence the concept of orders of intentionality. So most modern humans have fifth level intentionality. So Alberto believes, first level, that Katerina thinks, second level, that Marta wants, third level, Alberto to suppose, fourth level, that Katerina intends, fifth level. So that's what you need in order to populate imaginary worlds with characters. And so far as we know, only behaviorally modern humans, so post-Upper Paleolithic humans, have it. To be a Shakespeare, you need sixth order intentionality. So here's Robin Dunbar's illustration of sixth order intentionality. Shakespeare must intend that the audience believes, that Iago intends that Othello supposes, that Desdemona loves Cassio, who in fact loves Bianca. And only 20% of us have sixth order intentionality. You're more likely to be a Shakespeare if you're female. I'll come to that in a moment. And mercifully, you don't need sixth order intentionality to enjoy a sixth order production. Otherwise, theatres would be bust. The greater the degree of intentionality, therefore, the greater the imaginative capacity and the more compelling the stories that can be told. Now, this capacity for sixth order intentionality made for world-class grooming, for massive opiate outpourings, for massive feelings of well-being and confidence, for massive relationship forging. Most of the real talking in the Upper Paleolithic world, as indeed in ours, took place in the evening, where, as with us, most of the eating was done. They gathered around the fire, it was fairly dark, body language wasn't much use in the firelight, spoken language was much better. So these sixth order Upper Paleolithic Shakespeares held their audiences spellbound, and Darwin, say Dunbar and Gamble, was quick to reward them. So these Shakespeares, they got status, they got meat, they got sex, and they got progeny. So evolution selected very strenuously for greater orders of intentionality. I've talked a lot about language. Language is the predominant medium for the exchange of facts, but facts are relatively inconsequential, I suggest, compared to the expression of emotion and the formation and the expression of identity. Language works at the level of consciousness, and almost nothing of what we are is determined by our consciousness or resides in our consciousness. We're almost all below the surface. That's the great observation of Freud, of Jung, of everyone else who's written about psychoanalysis, of everyone who's dreamed, and everyone who's had an altered state of consciousness in the waking state. Most of what I am and what determines my actions on a conscious level wells up from my unconscious. The unconscious has its own languages, which bear little or no relationship to the language in which I'm speaking now. So the archaeologist Stephen Mython suggests, for instance, that Neanderthals communicated by what he calls which is an acronym for holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic. And perhaps we're still fluent in it. Perhaps it's the language of the unconscious. There is anyway a good argument that or something like it is the main language which is spoken by very young modern humans, and that when we speak to them, we discover that we are fluent in it too. So baby talk, or if you read the journals, infant-directed speech is a universal language. We can all speak it, and we all do speak it when we're talking to babies. Experienced mothers don't speak it much better than the most callow first-time babysitter. We're hardwired for it. Our average pitch goes up. We use a wider range of pitches. We pause more. We elongate our vowels, and we make them clearer. We use shorter phrases, and we repeat more. We repeat more. We repeat more. In short, it's more musical than our usual speech. And that musical speech engages babies' attention far better than mere language. Singing to babies does an even better job. So lullabies, which are very similar in melody, rhythm, and tempo across cultures, improve babies' mood and encourage sucking, and therefore that all-important weight increase in premature babies. And it's worth observing that all human babies are, of course, born prematurely compared to non-humans. They have to be, because of their enormous heads holding their enormous brains. They'd never be squeezed out if they were left to gestate for as long as their bodies should gestate. And that's all led Stephen Mython to speculate that the musical aspects of baby talk evolved specifically to deal with the unusual and prolonged helplessness of human babies. Music speaks to us before words do, and more deeply than words do. The depth at which it works isn't just metaphorical. I can't be talked out of panic, but I can be sung out of it. And it's not just me. Music has a clearly demonstrable effect on your breathing, on your heart rate, on your blood pressure. It's working deep down in the brainstem, affecting centers that were ancient long before that neocortex was plastered over the top of our brains. It's used for physical healing by many cultures. It reduces the anesthetic and analgesic doses which you need in order to produce unconsciousness or pain relief. And music therapy is potent in mitigating many of the problems of patients with autism or OCD or ADHD. And Mython concludes from that music has a developmental, if not evolutionary, priority over language, and that therefore the neural networks for language are built on or replicate those for music. So hominins sang before they spoke, they hummed. So just taking stock very briefly before I close with something about the differences between men and women. Theory of mind is a characteristic which has been selected for very strenuously by natural selection. It's been so selected because relationality itself confers a massive selective advantage. Language is one of the main architects and maintainers of theory of mind. Language is one of the quintessential human characteristics. The more linguistic we are and the more theory of mind we have, the more quintessentially normatively human we are. There are other mediators of personality, other and perhaps even deeper ways in which relationship can be brokered. So music is one of those, particular, the type of musical speech used particularly by mothers to their children. And there are many other very important non-verbal media. And it's perhaps significant that the human eye, very unusually, has a prominent white area, the sclera, which makes human eyes particularly potent in signaling. Humans have much more eloquent eyes than dogs. It's obviously dangerous to say that to possess certain characteristics or to possess them to a greater extent makes somebody more quintessentially human, because the flip side is to say that non-possession makes someone less human. I'm not going to deal with that now. There are well-recognized legal safeguards to stop such judgments becoming toxic. Now, quickly, are female and male minds the same? This is a real minefield. I'll say merely this. Gender differences in social cognitive processes are a long discussed issue, in particular those which concern theory of mind. The main theoretical framework is still that of Baron Cohen. Yes, that's Borat's brother, and that's the theory which distinguishes between empathizing and systematizing. So females on average are more disposed to an empathizing style, to identify others' mental states, to predict their behavior and respond with appropriate emotions. Males are on average more disposed to systematizing. So they tend to regard human situations as systems, the rules of which can be inferred. And once you have inferred the rules, you can work out what the role of each individual within that system is going to be. Behavioral studies support that analysis. Females score higher than males on tests relating to the affective dimensions of social cognition, emotion recognition, social sensitivity, empathy, emotional intelligence. And the functional neuroimaging studies do what the behavioral studies predict. Now, one of the constantly repeated mantras in modern Western medicine is that the ideal for the consultation is shared decision-making, in which the clinician and the patient cooperate in order to discover and to deliver the desirable result. Just this year, Sigrini and others looked at how gender influenced cooperative expectations of behavior. So they got pairs of men and men, and men and women to work together on a prisoner's dilemma type problem, and they then compared the way that they worked. Male-male pairs had the lowest mutual expectation and the lowest rate of cooperation. Female-female pairs were more cooperative than male-male pairs. The women were significantly better than men in predicting the degree of cooperation they would be. Men were significantly more cooperative when they interacted with a woman, presumably because they wanted to impress her as a potential mate. Overall, mixed pairs expected and got more cooperation and achieved the best collective outcome. And that's the interesting observation which I want to take into my very final set of observations. So what are the consequences of all this for consultations? Language in the form that humans have it is, if not unique to humans, at least very unusual in the natural world. Certainly the way that humans wield it seems to be unique to humans. It seems then to be a defining characteristic of humans. Since language then is part of the stuff of which we're woven, part of the stuff that makes us what we are as a species and what we are as individuals, it can, if it's used properly, humanize us. And if it's not properly used, it can dehumanize us, quite literally. This is a very trite observation. We all know the effect of language. All I've done is to suggest a few reasons from our evolutionary history why this might be the case. Language is a potent, if not a necessary, vehicle for story, and stories are how we make sense of ourselves. That we don't, in the contemporary world, make much sense of ourselves is a symptom of the inadequacy of our stories. We have no religious meta-narratives anymore, and the alternative stories, which include the idea that we're just economic entities, playing parts in the free market dialectic, or in a national state in which individuals are subsumed, or that we're mere self-authors writing our own lives without reference to others, are woeful. Since we need stories, since we are stories, we will take and believe any story that we can get rather than live without one. And we can see, can't we, a number of recent political examples of exactly that. Now, consultations in relation to pregnancy are likely to be important elements in the constructions of a woman's own and a father's own story. Medical consultations, of course, involve language, but not only language. They involve other media for communication too, but language is a potent grooming tool, a potent way of causing opiate release, increasing well-being and trust, generating a better atmosphere for a story. Women with, on average, a higher degree of intentionality than men are likely to be more acutely responsive to the verbal and non-verbal content of the medical conversation. That conversation is likely to be more eloquent, either for good or for bad, in the construction of the woman's own story. The conversation can humanize or dehumanize. We make strenuous efforts in guidelines and training to ensure that the verbal content of consultations is sensitive and satisfactory. The non-verbal content is likely to be at least as important and is generally wholly ignored. This is an argument for the compulsory teaching of the humanities in medical school and for essays on the Iliad and John Donne to be required for the reaccreditation of doctors. Now, very finally, that there may be a tendency to assume that there might be an unhelpful dissonance where a male clinician advises a female patient. And certainly it's right that male clinicians on average are likely to be less empathetic than female clinicians. And that's not only because they can't share the experience of pregnancy themselves. Female patients are going to be particularly sensitive through mind reading, through greater intentionality generally, to that relative lack of empathy. You might think, therefore, that male clinicians are likely to be less satisfactory co-authors of the woman's story than female clinicians. They are, as I put it, less likely to humanize and more likely to dehumanize. But remember the bottom line of that Sigarini paper: the best collective outcome resulting from the greatest cooperation in figuring out a serious moral problem, the prisoner's dilemma, akin to many of the issues discussed in a difficult pregnancy conversation, came with male-female pairs. So if the consultation can be seen, as we're urged that it should be seen, as an exercise in shared decision-making, the pairing of a male clinician and a female patient might perhaps counterintuitively produce not only a more functional decision-making process, but also a better result. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Foster. I'll just remind to those who are watching, if you want to submit any question, feel free to do so through a Q&A function of this Zoom webinar, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end of the session. Our third speaker of this first session is Dr. Melissa Maioni, and she's a visiting professor at the Faculty of Bioethics at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum University. She's a member of the Bioaesthetics Group of Studies within the UNESCO Chair of Bioethics and Human Rights, and she's the author of 2 books on the topics of bioethics at the beginning and the end of life. Her presentation today will have a title, Women and Love in the Healthcare Context, the Female Contribution to the Medical Profession. You have the word now.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And sorry for my Italian English, but okay. Okay. I want to share my presentation. Okay, you can see, can you see it?
Yes, Melissa, we can.
Okay. Okay. Here we want to affirm that the ability to generate and preserve life in women, although it is implemented at its best in the experience of conception, childbirth, and the growth of the progeny, is not only limited to it. It's not the activity in reference to the children that defines this feminine ability, but it is the women's own identity, the feminine quid that this ability arises from, which is expressed only later in the activity. But what is it that makes a woman a woman? Is it perhaps the only biological datum which defines my being a woman? Considering anatomy and physiology can be a good starting point, and especially in our historical period, I would say necessary, but not a sufficient one. We lose a very precious part of the definition of a woman, since it's not just her body. Edith Stein, a brilliant intellectual in the earliest years of the 20th century, wrote a great and still actual treatise on the theme of women, from which we collect some thoughts in order to structure our work. She argues that there is an essential common trait, something that she calls the deep core of the female soul, which consists of the profound need to give love and to receive love, and therefore the desire to rise, overcoming the anguish of one's concrete current state to a higher reality. And she contains, but with that, did we grasp the deep core of the female soul? There could, of course, be many other types of women, but I believe that as they are types of women, they will all have this common ground: to become what one must be, to make one's sleeping humanity unfold and mature in the best way, with that particular individual imprint that is required of her, make her mature in that union of love that alone can revitalize this flourishing process, and at the same time excite and push others to perfection and maturity. This is the woman's deepest need, a need that reveals itself in many aspects. It is a specific female need. It is not simply human. We can analyze several aspects of what Stein says. At first, she writes the expression to become what one must be. According to the author, therefore, there is a woman being who precedes me, and that I must pursue not for a sterile imposed obligation, but because this is the woman's deepest need. This need, in a dialectical logic, corresponds to something that calls me, that is required of me, not out of obligation, but out of necessity, the need for the completeness of my being and my perfection, the eternal life in the case of Stein. This aspect returns later when she specifically mentions female education. She says, we have thus come to a certain understanding of what we must understand with education, the process by which the potentialities of the soul are molded into an already foreseen structure, where the expression already foreseen assumes that there is something that precedes choices and behaviors of the women in this sense. Specifically, the author states that it is God himself who defined this structure. We must distinguish between the purpose of education of the human as such and the specific purpose of female preparation and the individual education of each girl. This purpose cannot be set at our pleasure, but has already been determined by God. We can therefore affirm that, according to this anthropological and metaphysical framework, the feminine quid, which defines the woman herself, must be discovered and not constructed. It is natural for us to ask ourselves, starting from who the woman is and what defines her in a substantial sense, what is the activity that belongs to her, namely her mission. The authors argues the nature and mission of women need a training that leads to carry out an effective love. Starting from these statements, we can say that the most appropriate activity of women is carrying out an effective love, which, using a deliberately ambiguous term, we could rephrase with the expression to make love. We often use the term to make love, referring exclusively to the physical and erotical sphere. Yet, this expression finds a fuller and happier meaning in what we are going to argue. How does a woman make love? How can a woman build love? Drawing on Stein's thought and on the anthropological reading of the Old Testament, we can see how man is entrusted with the task of dominating the earth. The woman, on the other hand, is invested with the responsibility of procreation and progenies. Men and women help each other in carrying out these tasks. Stein wisely calls the tasks relating to women gifts. In women, the attitude of protecting, preserving, and developing the being in formation and in growth, Therefore, the gift of a more physical kind for her to know how the life closely united to another him and calmly to gather strength and to endure pain, deprivation, and to adapt. The gift of a more spiritual nature of being interiorly oriented towards the concrete, the individual, the personal. The gift to know how to grasp them in their characteristics and to adapt to them. The desire to cooperate in their development. The woman makes love precisely in this sense, through these peculiar gifts, which are peculiar to herself and which derive from her being a mother. All of this certainly depends on a woman's vocation to motherhood. The woman completes her being a woman through her acting as a woman and as a mother. But what can we say about the virtues of a mother? Let us try to list some of them. The first, patient. During pregnancy, you learn to expect. Patience is acquired in the experience of gestation. The second, oblation. Childbirth is the imagined point of no return of a pain that requires me to sacrifice myself to give life to another. Already from the conception, I make room for alterity that takes something away. This oblation continues in the management of daily life. Third, the ability to devote herself to several areas at the same time. When a woman becomes a mother, she does not stop being a wife. Fourth, fortitude. A mother must be strong, as she will be the reference point for her children forever. It is to her that a child appeals in every difficulty. Fifth, you do not become a mother, you are a mother. The experience of motherhood is all-encompassing. One cannot escape from it. Sixth, hope. The mother is the one who not only gives us the physical life, but she teaches us the beauty of living. We recall that there are several authors who deal with the ethics of care within the broader panorama of the ethics of virtues. In particular, Tong argues that care itself is the main and purely feminine virtue which constitutes the implantation of the ethics of virtues. In our opinion, the emphasis on care must be placed more on the relational characteristic of care rather than on its virtuous identity. These gifts, using Stein's vocabulary, can certainly go beyond the applicative horizon of naturalness stricto sensu, overflowing from the family boundaries and spreading beyond what is mine, as only the good can do, away from home, opening up to the supernatural. My acting as a woman, my being a mother, can go beyond the son by blood, and according to the order of charity, can also extend to others who, receiving my maternal love, become, in a certain sense, children. Jan Hallan Matlary, in the book A Choice of Love, identifies 3 ways in which a woman can do her job: working well, working as a service, work as love. Obviously, all of these methods have positive aspects, which are gradually improving from one level to another, according to an order of increasing completeness and of ever greater generosity. Working well draws its meaning from necessity to respond above all to social utility, personal satisfaction, and the achievement of a result. Work as love, besides doing all these, questions me in freedom. How much do I want to give of myself, and to which extent? The other makes out of being a mother in a physical sense the key to understand what is the way to entirely work as a woman. She says, just as a mother, I can easily understand how work can be a service and how it can transform itself when one is motivated by the right intentions. And she continues, once again, in a human context, the work accomplished with the spirit of service is gratifying. The nurse who helps the sick knows this really well, or the teacher who helps the weakest pupil, but often the mighty people, all caught up for their business, are far from this humanitarian perspective. Work performed with a spirit of service is the best device to change the world. It is the indispensable prerequisite for a politics that goes beyond the mere struggle for power, and it is the key of human compassion and communitas. This work must be done well, but it must also have a right objective to serve others and society. Here, then, that work labored at the level of love can generate, in its highest sense, as well as family love. I can therefore make love working for the good of the others. Let us ask ourselves, what characteristics must this work have to be loved? As Erickson states, generativity, we said, encompasses procreativity, productivity, and creativity, and thus the generation of new beings, as well as of new products and new ideas, including a kind of self-generation concerned with a further identity development. A sense of stagnation, in turn, is by no means foreign even to those who are most intensely productive and creative, while it can totally overwhelm those who find themselves inactivated in generative matters. The new virtue emerging from this antithesis, namely care, is a widening commitment to take care of person, the products, and the ideas one has learned to care for. What makes work not only service but generative love is certainly care, the care of the bond with the neighbor, the attention in space and time to the person in front of me, of the things that are entrusted to me, of the business that I am managing. Only this type of work, an expression of my love, generates life, generates sons. Only love creates, said Father Massimiliano Maria Kolbe. Certainly, I cannot donate this love to myself on my own. So, what is the primary engine of care? The awareness of being a daughter myself and the love that another has given me. It is the gratitude and love that I have received that drives me to love and take care of others. Being aware of my poverty and my need, I can welcome the emotion of my heart that pushes me to take care of the other, to have love and mercy for him. Each of us is a son and will never stop being one, even becoming a parent in turn. We feel like sons when we live the experience to be loved in our turn. Says Eric Fromm, all these experiences become crystallized and integrated in the experience. I am loved. I am loved because I am mother's child. I am loved because I am helpless. I am loved because I am beautiful, admirable. I am loved because mother needs me. To put it in a more general formula, I am loved for what I am, or perhaps more accurately, I am loved because I am. This experience of being loved by mother is a passive one. There is nothing I have to do in order to be loved. Mother's love is unconditional. It's from the experience of being loved that we can love in turn. This can happen in one's family of origin, or if this has dysfunctions in the relationship with God. It goes without saying that some professions will exist that better than others will enhance this feminine dimension of care. As Stans reports, if the specific task of women is to protect and to develop a man's life and his individual skills, it will be female professions that can carry out these activities even outside of the marriage. Among these, the medical profession certainly stands out, which puts the treatment as its object. It is precisely by virtue of the feminine quid that Stein emphasizes the suitability of women for this kind of activities, which go beyond the need for medical competence. Interpreted as such, the medical profession is undisputedly charitable and can be counted among the social professions largely arose in our times, which can rightly be considered specifically feminine, just like domestic activity. In all these professions, a purely maternal action is exercised, the care of a large family. Here, one asks for an even greater energy of love than in one's own family. In fact, the natural link is missing. The number is much greater. And for the most part, they are people who, due to their qualities and behavior, are often more revolting than attractive. The medical female doctor, while carrying out clinical activity in everyday life, is generating because she cares and loves, and will be a mother by virtue of that typically female trait that distinguishes her from a male one. The female doctor will be able to love vulnerabilities and fragilities, and the patient will be able to experience being loved without giving something in return, but for the sole fact of being there and having needs, exactly as children do when they are in mother's womb. The female doctor will then have the task of always transmitting hope, cultivating the beauty in the patient's heart, even where death is coming for. Another food for thought that connects women and care comes from the traditional Christian and Jewish context. Among the corporal works of mercy, we usually include the visit to the sick people, which in fact correspond to the daily activity of a doctor. When in the scripture we speak of mercy, we refer to the rich meaning contained in the Hebrew word rekamim, formed by rehem, which means uterus, and maim, which means waters. This term speaks to us of a maternal component of God, technically of the uterus of God, who generates us perpetually. He who is the root of every generation and of every love. This term speaks to us about a visceral love full of compassion toward one's children. We see that if the visit to the sick is lived according to mercy from the perspective of work as love, it actually involves a dimension of our being that has to do with the feminine, a visceral, uterine love for the other. Reworking what has been said so far, we ask ourselves, can the work of a mother be translated into the profession? In response, we propose to consider a paradigm that we will call professional motherhood, meaning with this formula, the possibility of being mothers also in carry out our work. I choose to realize my being a woman and therefore a mother wherever I do my service and my work, inside and outside the family. If applied to the healthcare context, some questions obviously arise. Can we define a new generative medical ethics based on this paradigm? What kind of behavior should a female doctor adopt in the doctor-patient relationship? The attempt to apply female ethics to the area of care and the doctor-patient relationship was made by several authors. We remember the feminist bioethicist Susan Sherwin in her famous text No Longer Patient, or Caroline Gilligan, or Nell Noddings, or Gensabella Fornari, for example. With beauty, motherhood embodies pain, and as a good mother knows, self-forgetfulness, the self-giving dimension that involves take care of the other, selflessly placing ourselves at the service of others, losing ourselves, allows us to glimpse more and more clearly our humanity. Giving life is not just giving birth to the world once and for all, but continuing to give birth every day, maintaining even when it costs, as long as life costs. In sacred scripture, we find this quotation: "To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pains and the pains of your pregnancy. With pain, you will give birth to children. The female doctor will therefore generate it by forgetting a little about herself, just as mother do." this is not a question of relaunching a model of paternalistic doctor-patient relationship declined in the feminine. In fact, it results in a reduction in the thickness of the patient's figure, in their ability to understand, in their freedom of choice. Rather, it is a matter of leveraging the relationship. A mother is a mother in relation to what she is to her child. The doctor is a doctor in relation to what he is for the patient. As a doctor, I recognize my role in terms of the relationship that binds me to you, patient. As a mother accompanies and makes her children grow up, indulging their inclination, orienting it at the same time towards the good, educating them to life. In the same way, the female doctor will be able to support patient in the treatment path, making day after day increase the trust, and that is at the basis of the relationship, giving themselves completely to the care of the suffering life that challenges them to accompany. This making love, being a mother, taking care of one's profession is possible. An important aspect which puts being a mother and being a doctor in common is certainly the body datum. The female corporeality, understood as corper, is questioned in experience and is connected to the lived experience, live. Much more than is possible in the male. In fact, in being a mother, the relationship with the offspring is established from the first moment of conception and continues even after birth. When the relationship of the newborn with the mother continues to have a touch as a preferential channel. Second, in exercising one's own generativity, a recognition of intercorporeity and intersubjectivity is presupposed, which consists in perceiving others as bodies, relating to them and experience otherness. Third, in the exercise of medical profession, corporeality being the object of the doctor's attention and the first object of evaluation plays a key role. If, as stated by the embodied theories, every form of human knowledge and cognition is embodied and therefore passes through the experience of the body, it must be said that the female body, due to its own structure, has a privilege over the male body. Stein again says, it seems to me that women's soul lives and is present with greater intensity in all parts of the body and consequently is touched more deeply by what concerns the body. It goes without saying that on an intellectual level, starting from what has been said, we can theorize a bioethical model based on a generativity ethics in the health sector, which originates on love and not on self-affirmation. It will not only have a great moral depth, but it can be an archetype capable of bringing together the various organizational areas that gravitated around the medical profession, a care team composed of different professional figures, anthropology, bioethics, health efficiency and economics, generative welfare, for example, good of patients, in the broader perspective of the common law. This is why the consequences of this model will not only be found at the bioethical level, but also at the socio-economical level. Says Maria Pia Fontana, within the female code, which includes qualities and predispositions attributable above all to socio-cultural evolution rather than biological endowment, useful expertise can be identified for a creative and effective care work such as generativity, gift, emotional intelligence, and the sense of relational justice. These attitudes, consciously valued and considered in their political impact, can encourage generative welfare practice and renew all social organization and continues. It can be said that the virtuous dimension of the feminine is strongly involved in the philosophical framework of generative welfare, which is not it does nothing but systematize and mutually multiply the generativity of those who help and that of those who are helped by introducing them into the vital cycle of social life. Okay. This type of social reading must be understood as integrating the purely male attitude of practicing in the practice of the medical profession, and not as a substitute. Here, in fact, we highlight what women can give to society as herself, and not with a view to redeeming gender. Contextualizing the theme and anchoring these statements to the achievement of the common good is necessary in order not to trivialize the reflection and make it appear contestative towards the masculine. We therefore come to the conclusion of this intervention, which we want to summarize in 3 points. First, love in the medical profession will become generative when the doctored woman will be able to make love, to build love in others, to make room, to die a little for herself, as a mother does in welcoming children and raising them, guiding them, and accompanying them. Second, professional motherhood is characterized by all those qualities and virtues that make a woman and a mother. It should be understood in a broader perspective of care, even better, of generativity. Third, these intrinsic feminine habitus belonging to women by nature, which must be discovered through education but not constructed, can be the paradigm for a peculiar medical ethics capable of putting the relationship at the center and of enhancing feminine as a resource for society and bioethics. At the end, this is my favorite work, my daughter.
Thank you, Dr. Maioni, and thank you very much to all of our 3 speakers. We will now move to quick Q&A session. And the very first question we have is for Professor Rodriguez. And the question is, while relationality in care is important, is it something that should be enforced by law?
Thank you. I think law should sustain and should respect care. First, sustain, because I think caring for someone, it can be young, old, whoever, can be seen as a private good. And I think we have to realize that it's a service for common good. So welfare systems and work should reinforce and should take care so people can be caregivers, because I think caring for someone can be a very big burden for work, for psychology, for stress, and you are the only one that has to carry that big burden. So I think law and welfare systems should sustain that, but I think should also respect that. The law shouldn't interfere in that role. I think the principle of subsidiarity should be organizing it so that who and how does care for people is not interfered by law. That's what I think.
Thank you. The next question is for Professor Foster. And the question is, I want to ask if there's a study about difficulties that women healthcare workers might have because of their gender. If the answer is yes, could you mention about the conclusions, and could you possibly recommend some resources like a book or an article?
It may be that Alberto has something to contribute on this as well. I don't know. I know of 2. There's a paper by Papa and others, that's PAPPA, on the prevalence of depression, anxiety, and insomnia amongst healthcare workers. That's in Brain, Behavior, and Immunity journal. And the other is a paper by Sporthy, that's SPOORTHY, in the Asian Journal of Psychiatry. That's about mental health problems faced by healthcare workers. And the conclusion of both of those papers, which are both reviews of other papers, is that mental illness, particularly stress, depression, and anxiety, is much higher amongst women.
Thank you. We had one more question coming from the panelists.
Yeah, no, that was for me. Thank you so much, Charles. This question is for you. And I just want to ask, you were mentioning that language plays a crucial role. So translating this into the medical context, can we say that to love women in the medical context is also means to listen to her? And if this affects the model of shared decision-making in any way?
Right.
Thank you.
I suppose it depends how holistically you understand listen. If you are listening with your whole being to anybody, you are surely necessarily going to love them, because to listen with one's whole being is to understand. And if anybody, however vile they are on the outside, is really understood, they are lovely. But I guess there is a Christian dimension to this as well, isn't there? We are commanded to love. It's not an option not to love. Why is that? Because we're loved first, and because each person is made in the image of God, and love is the only response to somebody who is constituted that way. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, it does. Thank you, Charles.
Are there any other questions from the panelists? I'll just open the floor. Professor Garcia.
And for Charles and perhaps for Marta, so listening your presentations, I was imagining myself as a radical feminist. And most of the things you have been mentioning and supporting, scientifically speaking, would be challenged as stereotypes of the differences between men and women, etc. How you can answer in a simple way to this position of radical feminists that thinks that these kind of differences you have been emphasizing, also what Melissa was mentioning, they think are stereotypes, and that is part of the history of the culture, the prejudices, the bias of the contemporary or the past culture that we have been receiving as an heritage.
Charles, you go? I go?
Do you want to start on that?
I think it's a stereotype and a stereotype, oh my dear, to say that care is something for women. I do think that's something that is an stereotype. What I was trying to say is that we have a certain approach to care, because I think that approach that comes from our body is not translated into concrete functions, roles, characteristics. I don't agree with that. I think those can be stereotypes that comes from culture. And what I say is that our body gives us an orientation that that incline us and that makes us deal with care in a particular way. And I don't think feminists argue with that, because feminists are very different one from the other. So I put myself in the movement of feminists of difference, for example, that have been reflecting a lot on the meaning of the body and what does it reveal for our identity and our relationship. So I wouldn't put feminists as a whole group. I think some feminists that say that our body doesn't say anything about identity, our identity, wouldn't agree with me, but I wouldn't say all feminists.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned radical feminism.
I don't like that word. But I don't think care is something entrusted just for women. I think we do have a certain approach for care that needs to transform and to humanize the care field, but it's not something for women, because I think we need a culture with mother and a family with father.
I have very little to add to that. Feminism is a very broad church. I guess most mainstream feminism is about putting right historical power imbalances, and nothing that I said in my talk I would have thought is offensive to a feminist who characterizes him or herself in that way. I don't think it's part of the mainstream feminism, which I've just described, to pretend that men and women are biologically identical, or have no psychological differences between them. I'd have thought that most of what I said could be construed as part of the feminist project, in that it's an attempt to understand the real nature of that which both divides and joins men and women. Once one understands the real nature of those genders, one is much better placed to address the toxic inequalities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles and Margot.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time. So that was the last question. Thank you once again to our three speakers and to all of those watching session number 1. We will now have a quick break and we'll be back online at 3:45 Rome time, which is approximately in 7 minutes. And the session titled, and we'll be back with the session titled, "Is there a calling to love women in the medical context?" So see you in a bit. Okay, so welcome back everyone to today's webinar titled Feminist Ethics of Care and the Doctor-Woman Medical Encounter, What Love Has to Do with It. We will now continue with session number 2 under the theme of, is there a calling to love women in medical context? And our first speaker will be Professor Jonathan Herring from University of Oxford. He's a professor of law at the Faculty of Law, University of Oxford, and fellow in law at Exeter College, Oxford. He has published vastly on criminal, family, and medical law, with particular focus on how the law interacts with what he defines to be the important things in life, not money, companies, or insurance, but love, friendship, and intimacy. Professor Herring, you have the word.
Thank you very much, and greetings from Oxford. It's great that you're all here. Congratulations to Katerina and Thana and Alberto for organizing this event, and many others I know behind the scenes. I'm wanting to talk today particularly about vulnerability and vulnerability in the female patient-doctor encounter. There have probably been 2 main contributions from feminist thought to medical ethics in recent years particularly. One is ethics of care, and the other is universal vulnerability. But in fact, I think, as will become clear during this talk, those 2 dovetail closely together. So what I'm going to do is to start by presenting the standard models of doctor-patient interaction. Then I'll move on to explain universal vulnerability theory. And then I will seek to apply that to the doctor-patient encounter. But what I will be focusing on is not the vulnerability of patients, about which a lot have been written, but rather on the vulnerabilities of doctors in that encounter and the significance of that. So starting off with the standard models of doctor-patient interactions. Of course, in the past, this was dominated by a view that doctors were the boss. The doctor diagnosed the patient, told the patient what needed to be done, and the role of the patient was simply to agree. But nowadays, that model would be seen as hopelessly outdated. More modern versions perhaps would fall into broadly 4 categories, which I'll outline now. First of all, we have paternalism, but not the paternalism of the past, where the job of the patient was to be patient and simply to say yes. Now we would accept that the patient, even under this paternalistic model, has the right to ask questions, has the right to say no, has the right to be involved. But under the paternalism model, it would still be expected, unless the patient had a particularly good reason, that the patient would agree with the doctor. It would prioritize medical expertise. A second, probably more popular model would be seeing the doctor as a co-decision maker. This is the view that doctors and patients both have their areas of expertise that they bring to the consultation. So on this model, the role of the doctor would be as set out in this GMC guidance just recently produced in the UK. The GMC is the professional body of doctors. That the doctor must make sure the patient realizes they have a right to choose, that the doctor knows, that ensures that the patient has the right information, and then that the doctor and patient together try and reach an understanding, combining their expertise. On a third view, the primary role of the doctor is to provide information. The doctor must describe the condition, set out the alternative courses of action, answer questions that the patient might have, disclose risks to the patient, and then essentially leave the patient to provide, to come up with their own answer. The doctor's a little bit like Siri, if you like. Fourthly, on the therapist model, here the doctor is helping the patient to reach the decision, but to encourage the patient to use their own values, maybe helping them to talk through the issues, to help the patient reach a conclusion which is logical, a conclusion which is informed and consistent with the patient's values. And I suspect many doctors working today would probably fall within one of those 4 models. And probably which are chosen might depend on the personality and character of the doctor, but they'll also depend on the patient themselves. Turabian has suggested that the doctor has to dance with the patient. There'll be some patients who will very much want the paternalistic model. I'll remember sitting in on a consultation my father had with a doctor, and when the doctor was asking him, what do you think should be done? He very angrily replied, you're the doctor, you tell me. He clearly took the view that it was not his job as a patient to have to make decisions. Other patients will very much want to be informed and to be involved and perhaps even in charge of the decision. Secondly, it may depend on the nature of the issue that's being asked. There may be some kinds of medical procedure where the patient will not expect the doctor to be recommending a particular course of action. Some people might see abortion as one, where perhaps it would be out of place for the doctor to say to the patient, I think you should have an abortion, or even I think you should not have an abortion, unless there were particular medical issues that were arisen. Whereas there might be other issues where the patient would very much be seeking advice from the doctor. But I think there are problems with all of those 4 sort of contemporary models. First, they all see the doctor's role as essentially a cerebral one. That the doctor's role is to speak, provide information, to ensure the decision is rational and informed. There's nothing of the emotion in the doctor's role there. Secondly, they all see the doctor as doing something to the patient. The doctor's not receiving anything from the consultation. The doctor is giving advice. The doctor is informing the patient, and the patient is receiving that. There's nothing that's given back. All of those models also reflect what's been called in the literature the art of detachment, that the doctor should keep a distance with the patient. The role of the doctor is not to become emotionally involved and to have a professional detachment, it's often called. And underlying what I think is the flaw in all of those is that there's no recognition of the vulnerability of doctors in the doctor-patient relationship. Now, as I've said, I'm not wanting to deny that patients are vulnerable, but I think it's easy to exaggerate the patient being the extremely vulnerable one and the doctor being the all-powerful one. And it's that I want to explore further. So I move on to the second part of my talk, which is looking at universal vulnerability theory. So what do I mean by vulnerability? And I suggest in essence, someone is vulnerable if, first of all, they are at risk of a harm, they lack the resource to be able to avoid the risk of that harm materializing, and they'd not be able to adequately respond to the harm if the risk did materialize. Now, normally, when vulnerability is used, we use it to describe a particular category of people. So this is how it's often used by politicians and government, that group of people are vulnerable. We might think of the elderly as being vulnerable. Certainly at this time of COVID in England, the government have listed special categories of people as being vulnerable or extremely vulnerable, and special regulations are used to govern them. Normally, when an individual or a group of people are seen as being vulnerable, resources are given to them with the aim of them overcoming their vulnerability. Vulnerability is something to escape from. If you're labeled vulnerable, it's normally assumed that you therefore lack the ability to look after yourself. Someone needs to protect you from harm. That mainstream use of vulnerability, I think, is misguided and is wrong. But that understanding of vulnerability must be read alongside the legal self. What I mean by the legal self is how the law tends to understand individuals. That is, people, the law thinks a self is someone who is independent, is capacitous, has mental capacity to make decisions, and is rational. Now that is seen as the legal ideal. People who can't comply with that ideal are therefore seen as vulnerable. Someone who doesn't have full mental capacity, someone who's not fully rational, someone who is dependent upon others is vulnerable. But to the law, the vulnerable people are suboptimal. They're not the focus of the law, they're the exception. And so the legal regime typically prioritizes certain kinds of rights, in particular autonomy, your ability to make decisions for yourself, bodily integrity, privacy, and liberty. Those would perhaps be seen as four of the key rights that most legal systems preserve. But those are rights which are all about keeping people away. They're all about separating others. I should be free to exercise my autonomy. Others shouldn't be interfering with my freedom. I have the right of privacy to be able to keep other people away. But I think that understanding of the legal self is profoundly misguided as well. So I reject then the idea of vulnerability being particular groups of people who are vulnerable. and I reject this promotion of the legal self as an independent, rational, capacitous person. So what do I support then? Martha Feynman has developed universal vulnerability theory. And that is that vulnerability is inherent in the human condition, that we are all equally vulnerable, that it is part of what it is to be a human being. I've developed this in a book called Law and the Relational Self, but I'll just outline some of my thinking on in what sense we're all vulnerable. Well, first of all our bodies are vulnerable to disease, and we've seen that in COVID this year. Previously, when I talked about this was seen perhaps as a surprising idea, but now I think it's almost uncontroversial that we are open and our bodies are vulnerable to illness at any point. We also, all of us, depend upon the services of others and of the state. We might like to think of ourselves as independent and self-sufficient, but we all need resources from the state. It's fascinating to me how we often talk about special accommodations that are put in place to help disabled people. So we have special lifts that are put in to help disabled people. We have special services that are provided from them. But of course, we all need services. None of us can get to the 6th floor of a building, whether we need the lift or the stairs. We need something. We all depend upon sewage. I well remember when I gave a talk along these lines, someone asking me afterwards saying, well, surely a baby is vulnerable because they need to be fed by an adult, whereas an adult can feed themselves. To which I said, well, where do you get your food from? You need your food from a supermarket. We overlook how we are dependent upon others, and we can see the vulnerability in others. We are emotional people. And again, perhaps this is being highlighted in COVID, how dependent we are on for our emotional support, for our well-being from our relationships. And we are, I believe, relational selves. Charles was touching on some of these themes, and I developed them in this book, that our understanding of who we are, our identity, emerges from our relationships. That doesn't mean, because I believe in universal vulnerability, that everybody is therefore equally vulnerable. And as Martha Feynman explains in this quote, we are all individually positioned differently. So although we are all in our nature equally vulnerable, I believe the way society is organized, there are some people in certain contexts who are given privileges and benefits so they can overcome their vulnerable nature and therefore can experience more power than others. So while it's common in the public discourse to look at vulnerable people and say, oh, they're lacking something, they have been deprived of free choice. It's more helpful, I think, to look at the powerful and say, how have they been able to overcome their innate human vulnerability? So the claim is that we're all in our nature vulnerable, but society's provisions may have made us differently situated. Now, vulnerability is normally seen as a bad thing. People don't want to be vulnerable. They want to be self-sufficient. But as Daniel Bedford and I have written in this edited book, there are great benefits to our vulnerability. Actually, vulnerability is a really good thing. It means we have to realize we can't do things on our own. We have to reach out to others. We have to seek cooperation. There's no point pretending that we are self-sufficient and can sort ourselves out. It requires us to be empathetic, to understand and to relate to others. It requires us to realize we're probably mistaken in what we believe, to have to be open to new ideas, that we don't know it all. And so although vulnerability is normally seen as an undesirable characteristic, I think it comes with many benefits. And doctors are often seen to be or presumed to be strong and in a privileged position, and in some ways, of course, they are. But as I show from some of these statistics, and Charles briefly mentioned this in the Q&A earlier, there are plenty of studies finding quite extensive mental health problems, addiction problems, feelings of suicidal feelings, rates of depression, and I've summarized some of the findings there, that doctors suffer. So what is the relevance then to the doctor-female patient interaction? First of all, as some of the speakers have already said, at the heart of the doctor-patient relationship should be care or love. As Feder Kitay has written, care is at the core of what it is to be a human being. A world without care would be a dismal world, that she writes. But it's easy to misunderstand care. Care, particularly for lawyers, can easily be reduced to an act of care. Care is for one person to bathe somebody else. And it's become particularly prevalent, understanding care as an activity in a society which is increasingly commercializing or commodifying care. So in the UK, increasingly state provision of care is being reduced to certain activities. So you will be assessed and you'll be told, right, you need 30 minutes of washing, you need 30 minutes of food preparation, you need 15 minutes of that, and then a sum of money can be produced to calculate how much it will cost, what budget should be given for your care. But understanding care in that way, just as an activity, I think is to badly misconceive it. Because care is essentially a relationship, not an activity. And I think it's interesting that there's been a powerful disability rights critique of the idea of care. Some of those with disability have complained about the word care, which at first sounds odd. But what they say is that if they are simply the recipient of care, they just become an object. If they're, the use of the word care implies that they have some weakness which someone comes in and mends. There's therefore this powerful concern that the word care is unhelpful. And I think that's right if care is simply seen as an activity. Because if care is then an activity, you are just an object who is washed or an object who is fed, and who would want to be treated like that? But that's not, I think, how people in caring relationships understand. All of the studies into care find care as a two-way relationship. Even where someone is quite profoundly disabled, the carer receives from the person that they are caring for. Indeed, many accounts of caring relationships talk about how the barrier between the carer and the cared for breaks down, that the person receives and gives at the same time. So in caring relationships, it's not a separation, a straightforward separation into the carer and the cared for. It's rather about a giving and taking, an intermingling of bodies and interests. When one party to the relationship is harmed, the other person is harmed. Caring relationships are multi-directional, they're two-way processes. So once we understand that as the nature of care, this idea of the doctor being ideally someone who is rational and emotionally detached is misconceived. It's that idea of care simply being an activity. So we should reject, I think, this detached idea of care. So once we understand that care then is a two-way relationship, the idea of actually there being responsibilities of the patient towards the doctor is not as strange as it at first sounds. So let me just give you four examples of how this might apply. So the first is REB, a case in England, and I won't go into all of the details, but it was a woman who was on a ventilator, keeping her alive. She made it clear she wanted to die. The team of nurses and doctors who had been looking after her for a long time were unable to switch off the machine. They'd become very closely attached to her. Nevertheless, the court had confirmed it was her right to have the machinery switched off. And in a rather sensitive and I think correct judgment, Lady Butler-Sloss was very careful not to criticize the medical team. They couldn't be expected, and the patient couldn't expect them to be the ones who switched the machine off. She was critical of the trust for not finding other healthcare professionals who had no pre-relationship with Ms. B to come in to do the procedure. So I think patients can't expect doctors to do things they do not want to do, must realize the emotional involvement and accept the emotional involvement. And that could tie in then with conscientious objection. I think for a patient to require a doctor to do something which is contrary to their conscience, and one of the arguments why that might be inappropriate would be that that wouldn't be showing respect of the patient towards the doctor. Clearly, abuse of a professional in terms of physical abuse or emotional abuse is particularly improper too. Secondly, a crucial part of being a good doctor must be compassion. And compassion is also involves emotion. It's not just awareness of the suffering, but as Jazari and colleagues say, it has to be being emotionally moved by the suffering, a wish to see that suffering stop, for habits relieved. And so proper compassion, good compassion, again, is not a detached thing. It has to have an emotional involvement too. And I think we can see legal implications of that. We have to be, the law has to be compassionate to doctors. We must be very wary about convicting doctors of gross negligence, manslaughter, being aware of the complexity of the situation they're in, being aware of the pressure that doctors face from clinical negligence, making sure that employment practices from doctors are respectful to them. Thirdly, I want to talk briefly about relational autonomy. Now, under the Kantian ideal, relational autonomy, making decisions, are a little bit like the academic philosopher sitting in his study. You might imagine someone like Alberto sitting in his study there. Having thought through all of the options, read all they need to read, thinking rationally and producing the answer. That's seen as the ideal under the Kantian model. Information, rationality is what governs decisions. And Lorraine Coe talks about the ideal autonomous man being self-sufficient, independent, and self-reliant. Willett and others argues that that's a masculine way of seeing things. I'm not sure they're necessarily saying that's how men necessarily make their decisions, but how it's a way of thinking that privileges the male norm and privileges the male way of thinking. There's no place there for emotion or sentiment or attachment to family or love or emotions. To the Kantian ideal of autonomy, if anything, those are challenges. They interrupt autonomy under the Kantian ideal. Relational autonomy is a different version, sees autonomy being made not by the analytic philosopher in his study, but rather in conversations over a cup of tea, in chats, in tears, in fear, where emotions and relationships are a key part of the decision. Now, appreciating the importance of relational autonomy also recognizes that relationships can be harmful to autonomy. Domestic abuse would be an obvious example of where a relationship can actually hinder someone's ability to exercise their autonomy. It involves recognizing the importance of a relational context, that someone's life is not just their own. They live it with others and through others, and the decision has to work for all of those involved. And that decisions have an important emotional side. And that might be particularly important in relation to women. I've mentioned domestic abuse already. You might also consider societal pressures on women to conform to stereotypes, for example, in relation to cosmetic surgery. There may be particular female life cycle issues, and I've mentioned there the menopause. So I think we do, when considering doctor-patient relationships, as well as the vulnerability of the patient, to recognize the vulnerability of the doctor. We have to recognize that this relationship between doctor and patient is an important part of the decision-making, that the relationship the patient is in an important part of the relationship, but that emotions are an important and valuable part of the interaction. And so it's in joining together and working through problems that true autonomy is found, not just in providing information. In the medical encounter, I would suggest, more important than sharing information and the encouragement of the rational are shedding tears and sharing fears. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Herring. Now, I just want to remind you, all those watching, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them through Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. And if your questions are directed to a particular academic, feel free to mention that too. Now, our next speaker is Dr. De Campos-Rodinsky. She is assistant professor at Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. She's currently Fang Fellow at the University of Princeton and research associate at the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights in Rome, where she also serves as a co-leader of the research group Dignity and Equity in Women's Health Issues. Her research interest lies in the area of global bioethics, international human rights, virtue ethics, and the human right to health. And today she will give us a presentation titled, "What Does Love Require of Healthcare Professionals Treating Vulnerable Women? Law and Policy Considerations of Duty of Care and Suffering." Dr. De Campos-Rodinsky, you have the word now.
Thank you. Thank you for Thank you for the introduction. As the title of my presentation suggests, I was tasked with answering the questions, what does love require of healthcare professionals treating vulnerable women? And what are some law and policy considerations within this context of duty of care and suffering? But before I answer these questions, I would like to start by asking this question to you, and would like you to please answer the poll. So what does love require of healthcare professionals treating vulnerable women? Do you think that love requires doctors to spend more time interacting with the patient? That's option A. Or perhaps you think that love requires doctors to be more present. That would be option B. Or perhaps you think that love requires doctors to be emotionally detached from their patient's suffering so that they are able to better attend to the patient's medical needs. In other words, doctors are here expected to have a professional detachment, as Jonathan Herring just mentioned in his talk. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer this.
You have to launch the quiz.
Sorry. Oh, you haven't.
We don't see the.
Oh, you don't see it. Oh.
At least the panelist.
No,
Yeah,
we do.
the panelists
just
can't
that
vote, I think.
Oh, panelists can participate.
Serena, can you manage that for me and
Yes,
tell me?
it's only for the attendees.
Okay.
So the attendees are replying, and we have 15 out of 22 people replying. So
Okay.
it's working. Let's give them another few minutes, or Tana, you tell me if you want to.
Thank you. Thank you,
Yes.
Serena. Would you tell me what the answers were, or do you have access to it, Serena?
Sure. Okay.
Yes, I just interrupt the polls, and then now you should see the results.
Okay, so it seems that 50% chose option A. So love requires doctors to spend more time interacting with the patients. 75% thinks that love requires doctors to be present, and only 6% of you think that doctors should be emotionally detached from the patient's suffering. So I answered this normative question in my paper in this way. I argued that, like most of you, 75%, I argued that love requires healthcare professionals treating vulnerable women to be present. And it seems that the majority of you would agree with me. But the half of you, I think 50% of you would think that time is also very important. And typically it has been argued that love requires healthcare professionals to indeed spend more time with their patients. Though spending more time interacting in the context of the medical encounter is a good thing, especially in our fast-paced healthcare reality, I contend that time is not sufficient. And I'll argue that love does not depend fundamentally on time. Instead, it fundamentally depends on presence, human presence. So being with the patient is necessary. Just being, not filling time by doing tasks, just being with is what love primarily requires of healthcare professionals treating vulnerable patients. I thought this distinction between time and human presence that I'm trying to make would be more easily grasped in the context of artificial intelligence, AI. This is because one of the main promises of AI, according to cardiologist Eric Topol, who is the author of a book published last year titled Deep Medicine: How Artificial Intelligence Can Make Healthcare Human Again. So the main promise of AI for Topol is that AI gives the gift of time for doctors. But what is AI? Marvin Minsky, an AI pioneer, defined AI in 1968. Yes, 1968 in this way. AI is the science of making machines do things that would require intelligence if done by man. AI operates with algorithms. These are instructions inserted in a computer for the purpose of solving certain problems quickly and efficiently. This is how AI gives doctors the gift of time. AI provides accurate diagnoses, sometimes within seconds. So it does save doctors time. And by saving doctors time, It is argued that AI would help doctors to spend more time with their patients and be more loving, caring, and empathetic, and build a relationship of trust between them. This is Topol's argument. But I challenge this argument in favor of AI as a loving tool for doctors. AI can certainly be very helpful in healthcare, and doctors would certainly benefit from more time, but I do not think that more time can substitute human presence. If the goal is to have good, loving healthcare, human presence is fundamental. And to put this argument forth, I started the paper contrasting two hypothetical scenarios. Scenario one shows Dr. Montes. She's a busy OBGYN in Brazil and a very busy mother of twins, age 2. To maximize the use of her scarce time, Dr. Montes uses AI in her clinical practice as much as she can. One of Dr. Montes' favorite AIs is the ultrasound app for smartphones, and she encourages her pregnant patients to use it, not only for the convenience of obtaining accurate ultrasound scans in the comfort of their homes, but also for the active patient involvement that it allows. Dr. Montes uses the ultrasound app with her patients, giving them careful instructions over the phone on how her pregnant patient and her partner should use the machine to capture the best images and the best sounds of the baby's heartbeat. And within seconds, Dr. Montes receives the scan results, and she interprets the captured images and sounds together with her patient. So this technology is a wonderful tool for fostering partnership between doctors and patients. And today, Dr. Montes is scheduled to visit one of her patients, Amy. Amy is doctor of 2 girls who has just miscarried a boy and is in the hospital for surgery with Dr. Montes. After the surgery, Dr. Montes is ready to go home where her twins and husband wait for her, but Dr. Montes decides to take 5 minutes to see Amy. Dr. Montes has only 5 minutes, and she is exhausted after a long work day. She's also very worried because one of her twins has been extremely sick for the past 2 days. So Dr. Montes really needs to go home as soon as possible and attend to the needs of her child and her family. But she decides to stop by for 5 minutes and see her patient. Amy is grieving. Dr. Montes comes into her room and remains silent. Dr. Montes has no words. She approaches her patient Amy with a silent yet warm touch on her shoulders, and a few minutes of silent yet deeply felt connection between the two is sufficient to touch Amy's heart. Those few minutes were sufficient for Amy to feel loved and cared for. Before Dr. Montes leaves, she explains that she just wanted to stop by for a couple of minutes and then she really needs to go home. Dr. Montes confesses that she's extremely worried and anxious. She discloses that she hasn't heard anything from her husband and that one of her baby boys is really unwell, so she really needs to rush home. Empathizing with Dr. Montes' worries, Amy smiles and asks Dr. Montes the boy's name. Theo, Dr. Montes replies. Amy then says that she will say a prayer for Theo, and with gratitude in her heart, Dr. Montes leaves Amy's room and rushes home. Now, while this is taking place in Brazil, a different scenario is unfolding at a children's hospital in Toronto, Canada. Dr. Lau is a busy 30-year-old OBGYN, father of 2 boys, aged 2 and 2 months. Like Dr. Montes in Brazil, Dr. Lau in Canada also uses AI and the ultrasound app for smartphones in particular. He really likes that. He uses AI as much as he can to maximize the use of his time. And AI does save Dr. Lau a lot of time. Interestingly, though, to incentivize doctors to spend even more time with the patients, with each patient, the local government of Ontario passed a tax deduction bill for hospitals, and it requires hospitals and doctors to stay with each patient for at least 20 minutes. Dr. Lau's hospital is implementing this policy, so Dr. Lau is required to stay with each patient for 20 minutes. Now, being extremely efficient and successful in his profession, 20 minutes often feels extremely long for Dr. Lau. Today, he's scheduled to visit one of his patients, Alice. Alice is a mother of 2 boys who miscarried a girl and is in the hospital for surgery with Dr. Lau. After the surgery, Dr. Lau is ready to go home where his family waits for him. But because of the new policy, Dr. Lau has to spend 20 minutes with his patient, Alice. Dr. Lau is exhausted after a long work day. Moreover, he's heartbroken. His wife has just filed a divorce complaint. The efficient and successful Dr. Lau appeared to be a rational and an emotionally detached doctor, but inside his heart is broken into a million pieces. His emotional attachment to his wife makes it difficult for him to choose to be present with his patient Alice for those 20 minutes. So to pass the time, Dr. Lau chooses to read to Alice a very long list of possible post-miscarriage treatments available to her. Dr. Lau chooses to have his eye glued to his iPad at all times to be able to hide his discomfort and his own wounds. And he very competently goes through all the different options, their pros, their cons. He doesn't disclose his opinion about those treatments, and he remembers to ask for Alice's preferred option and to take precise notes of everything she says. Alice is grieving, but Dr. Lau chooses not to address her emotional heartbreak. Since his own heart is broken, he chooses to close himself off as a protection mechanism to hide his own wounds. After efficiently taking notes of Alice's choice of treatment, he feels relief when he looks at the watch and sees that 19 minutes have already passed. So he cordially yet aloofly says goodbye and leaves on the 20-minute mark. Alice continues to grieve. Dr. Lau continues to grieve, yet none of them know of each other's grief. These 2 fictional stories share in common 3 main themes. First, the use of AI in healthcare practice. Second, the time is spent in the doctor-woman encounter. In scenario 1 is only 5 minutes, and in scenario 2 is 20 minutes. And third, the doctor's effective presence or lack of thereof in their encounter with the patient. So in scenario 1, Dr. Montes is present, and in scenario 2, Dr. Lau is not present. So my paper is centered around these 3 themes. Although AI is indeed a promising tool in healthcare, especially when it comes to expediency in allowing doctors to be more efficient and save time, the literature on ethics of AI in healthcare has not adequately addressed the fundamental issue at stake here. Good care does not fundamentally depend on time. It depends, I argue, on presence, human presence. While time is important and may be necessary, time is not sufficient for good, loving care. Dr. Lau in scenario 2 has plenty of time to care for his grieving patient Alice in a loving way, but he chooses not to do it. He has his own personal reasons to excuse his absent mind, but the fact is that he chose not to be actually present for those 20 minutes with Alice. He fills his 20 minutes with tasks. He has made himself busy instead of simply being present with her attending to her needs. On the other hand, Dr. Montes in scenario 1 has only 5 minutes to care for her grieving patient, Amy, but she chooses to be present and to love her patient in that very short amount of time. Dr. Montes does not do anything in particular during that encounter. In fact, Dr. Montes is silent for most of the encounter, and she does nothing actually. She's simply present. She's fully present. She turns towards Amy and attends to her needs. My point here is this: the fact that AI gives doctors the gift of time does not immediately translate into good, loving care, because doctors would still need to make a choice to love the patient in being present with her during the encounter. The word choice is not trivial when defining love. Charles Foster talked about the intentionality and the ethics of relationality. Love is both relational and intentional. According to Aquinas, it's an act of the will. And I think this means that love is a choice, a free choice to give oneself generously through one's presence for the good of the other. And because it's a free choice, love is a gift. Love gives the gift of presence. In this sense, to love the patient is to lavishly dispense one's presence to one's patients, especially in their moments of greatest vulnerabilities. Although AI can give the gift of time to both doctor and patients, AI cannot give the gift of human presence. AI may facilitate love by helping the doctor to be present, but AI in itself cannot love the patient. The doctor still needs to choose to love. True, one particular way in which AI can facilitate love is by giving time to individuals, making the choice of being together an easier, less burdensome one to make. But to claim that AI has the potential to transform relationships of care simply by optimizing one's use of time is perhaps a bit overrated. Now, this is not to say that time is completely irrelevant. Time and space are, in a way, necessary for the materialization of love, because human beings are physical beings. Marta Rodriguez talks about the centrality of our bodies, and that's because we are physical beings. So if one wants to love and be present with another, one needs, in one way, to choose to allocate some time and find the space to share one's presence. But ultimately, the core of love is still human presence, the sharing of existence, the sharing of experiences, the sharing of being, rather than merely doing stuff. In choosing to allocate 5 minutes of her time to her patient, and in choosing to go to the patient's hospital room to be with her, Dr. Montes and her patient Amy are choosing, in that doctor-patient encounter, to share each other's burdens and vulnerabilities. In doing so, they are choosing to love and care for one another. It is this shared experience that is necessary for the creation of a community of mutual love and care. Now, I expect at least 2 objections to my argument. The first objection is that presence is not always possible. This has become clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, when lockdowns and social distancing made it difficult, if not impossible, for individuals to be present with their loved ones. True, required lockdowns and social distancing have significantly affected healthcare, and the situation in care homes and certain ICUs with patients dying alone have in particular made evident how challenging it can be to be present with loved ones in all circumstances. Although physical presence is not always possible, love in times of COVID-19 has required creativity coupled with prudence. Melissa Maioni mentioned the creative force of love, and technologies such as the Zoom app have been a helpful creative tool in keeping people connected. It's what is allowing us today to be present to discuss with one another what love means in the doctor-women encounter. So these technologies have enabled us to love and be present and attend to the needs of those who are just one block away, as well as those who are a continent away. And similarly, I think that AI can be designed and regulated by laws and policies in such a way that fosters love, presence, and the common good in community. The second objection to my argument is that patients may not want to be loved and be with the doctor. The patient may feel intruded and prefer to be left alone. True, the autonomy of the patient ought to be respected. Love and presence, therefore, cannot be imposed. Love is a gift to be freely given and freely, not coercively accepted. And if the gift is not accepted, the will of the patient in rejecting it ought to be respected as well. However, at the same time, in their duty to care for the patient and to will the patient's good, the doctors ought to verify whether this rejection is a justifiable desire to be in solitude rather than a desire linked to a depression or a fear to be a burden. And AI here might be an auxiliary tool for an accurate and expedited diagnosis of mental health conditions of which the patient's desire for privacy or seclusion might be symptoms. So to conclude, I have argued that love does not depend fundamentally on time. Instead, it fundamentally depends on presence, human presence. Being with the patient is necessary. Just being, not filling time by doing tasks, just being with is what love primarily requires of healthcare professionals treating vulnerable patients. And I explain this distinction between time and human presence in the particular context of AI. Now, I am curious to see if I have convinced you, or at least some of you, to reconsider the question of time. So I'll ask you to again can you?
Yes, they are aligned.
Okay, so
Yes.
I'll ask you again to please take a look at the question and select your preferred answer. And the question is for the panelists who cannot see the pool. The question again is, what does love require of healthcare professionals treating vulnerable women? A, love requires doctors to spend more time interacting with the patient. B, love requires doctors to be present. And C, love requires doctors to be emotionally detached from their patient's suffering. How are we doing?
Only the 54% of people. So let's give maybe another few seconds. Still, okay, 13, 14. Okay, we only have 14 out of 22.
That's okay, that's good.
Okay, so I shared the results. You should see them.
Okay, so it seems now that 14% thinks that love requires doctors to spend more time, whereas we had 50% in the beginning. Now we have 86% of you think that love requires doctors to be more present. And we had 0% saying that doctors are required to be more emotionally detached. So thank you. I think I succeed in convincing some of you to think about whether time is actually necessary for love to actually be materialized or not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have a question from someone from the audience. And the first question is to both Dr. De Campos-Rodinsky and Professor Herring. And the question is, in the UK, the NHS Choices website states that GPs spend an average of 8 to 10 minutes with each patient and advises patients to plan ahead to make sure you cover everything you want to discuss. How could presence have any effect if time is so short? Clinical professionals have to face the increased encroachment of instrumental rationality, AI, shortening of time, etc., on compassion, love, and mercy. And this question for both presenters.
Thana, do you want to go first?
Sure. Sorry. Yes, I think it's just a sad reality that we live in such a fast-paced, consumeristic healthcare. Our circumstances are just very fast-paced, and we see the patient as a client most of the time. So I think what we are trying to do here in discussing love, and what I try to do in discussing love as presence, is to try to have a critical view of that, and not being I think unrealistic in not recognizing the difficulties and the reality that we just don't have time, or patients do not have a lot of time to spend with their healthcare professionals, but perhaps to foster ways in which we can more creatively think about ways to create time as well, and to prioritize those things that are important.
Yeah, I think I'd just add in sort of with the themes of my talk that yes, quite clearly that's inadequate and not helpful for a patient to have what might be a very major decision having to be crammed into an 8 or 10 minute session. But I think that's not just harmful for the patients, it's harmful for the doctors as well, that they're being forced to deal with things inadequately, that they themselves aren't being able to properly enter into a caring relationship with the patient. And so it harms both sides, and might help explain some of those statistics I referred to about the poor mental health of doctors. And of course, these decisions are often made by the managers of hospitals rather than actually the clinicians themselves.
Thank you. The next question is from Professor Garcia.
It was not a question, it was a comment around this topic, because sometimes the problem is not, I would say, the avidity or the doctor treating the patient as a client. Because in Europe, for example, where it's a social medical system, in public hospitals and also private hospital, but take public hospital, you don't have to pay. And there are some policies to be efficient in the timing for the people, not because you are going to raise more money, but because to shorten the waiting list of patients. You have a lot, it's overpopulated. And then if you spend 1 hour, that will be wonderful. The problem is that the people has to wait 2 months, 3 months for an appointment. It's not only to raise more money, only to I would say to defend the doctors that are vulnerable.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and it goes, I suppose, to the problem of funding of national health services. I think too, it shows a concern that some of the issues about which people are going to see their doctors are, in fact, the result of cutbacks in other services. And I think we're often seeing doctors are being the ones who are being turned to because there's other forces in society which are making people ill, culture of overwork, inadequate childcare, lack of support for children with special needs. The list could go on of the kind of things that then an exasperated, say, parent with a child with special needs is going to see their doctor, where actually resolving the issue further down the line would be far more productive.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree. And I just want to clarify that I didn't try to say that efficiency is not a relevant consideration, especially in public policy. I think most of the public policies, especially in healthcare, are done based on cost benefit analysis. And that's not to say that that's not irrelevant. But I think I was just trying to maybe ask if that's the only consideration that we or policymakers in general should have in mind.
Mhm.
We have the next question to Professor Herring. You mentioned that the law has to be compassionate to doctors. In what ways can the law act upon this idea, upon recognizing their vulnerability?
This is a provocative question.
So I think there are 2 points I mentioned, perhaps two briefly. So one, I think, is looking at the issues around clinical negligence. And there's a lot of evidence that claims, the way that clinical negligence claims are dealt with by the legal system is absolutely disastrous for patients. And it's absolutely disastrous for doctors too. In fact, the only people it's not disastrous for are the lawyers. And we desperately need to find ways whereby we can deal with allegations and claims of clinical negligence that take into account both the real issues and concerns about which patients have, which is often not really wanting money, perhaps save in the most serious cases, but more wanting a reassurance that that mistake won't happen again, that lessons have been learned, an apology, full disclosure information. And certainly with lower level clinical negligence claims, there's lots of evidence that that's actually what patients want rather than money, but they're driven to the courts because there's no way of getting an apology or anything else like that. But similarly, for doctors, the system is designed to make them be less than candid, not disclosing what went wrong, trying to protect the legal position of the trust, which is disastrous for them emotionally as well. So I think we need a much more caring way of dealing with clinical negligence claims, and that would be the primary area I think I'd be looking at.
Next question is linked to this, and it's directed to both speakers. Do you think that the medical training at the moment supports doctors to be vulnerable in their interaction with patients?
Dana, you go.
I go first. As far as I know, I think that the doctors and the nurses I've been talking to, they have a desire to be formed in compassion, and I think there are some programs, some programs in some medical schools that are devoting part of the curriculum to train doctors to be compassionate. Now, Dr. Eric Topol, who I discuss in my paper, he says that being empathetic and be compassionate is part of who we are as humans. So that's something natural in us that doesn't need necessarily to be trained. But perhaps the environment that is not very conducive for that to emerge. So perhaps it would be helpful for medical schools to look into that. And I think at least some medical schools are making a choice, an intentional choice to foster this side and this virtue from in their students as well.
Yeah, I suspect there's a difference with which set of healthcare professionals you're talking about. So I think in relation to nurses, for example, there has been quite a lot of work in developing skills of compassion. But I think still in a lot of training for doctors, this idea of being professional, of being able to convince the client that you're a knowledgeable and authoritative person, and that therefore your direction should be obeyed is still there. And the idea that being detached is actually a good way to deal with the emotions that are involved. Don't start to feel things for your patient or you'll get emotionally exhausted. That's the sort of traditional advice, which I think is still being given, but I'm not sure at all that that's the helpful way to proceed.
Professor Garcia?
In Rome, we have a faculty in bioethics. A good percentage of the students are nurses and medical doctors, and they come to our university or follow our courses because they say they lack a formation about ethics, virtue, and whatever. And so they in Spain, I know, in Italy, I know, in Germany, I know that most of the studies in the medical schools and nursing schools, they study medical law, deontology, but they don't study ethics. They don't study enough bioethics. So I think this is a challenge, because if we want better nurses, doctors, I think, yeah, this is something that should be improved in the programs, because sometimes they are making prevail the technical thing, or the technical aspect that is, of course, necessary, and they become more and more specialized. But this more humanistic approach, I think, needs to be improved. There is a current of the kind of how the humanistic approach to medical care or the medical profession that is growing and growing because of the lack of this more humanistic approach. And presence and love, of course, belong to this sphere.
Yeah, just to add to that, a couple of times I've been brought into medical schools to talk, and I've always been asked to address the question of how do we avoid getting in trouble with the law? How do we behave legally, rather than how do we behave well? And of course, it's often forgotten that primarily the law's job is to set the bottom bar. This is the minimal what you have to do to comply with the law or ethics, rather than asking actually how to be a compassionate, good, or loving doctor.
And that the law is not going to make us good people and happy. This is not for the law. I am a lawyer by training. And
we have one more question, and it's directed to Professor Jonathan Herring. If we think of an act of care, non-relational care, as objectifying the person that we're caring for, which could possibly be the result of an attitude of the carer, but also from the side of the patient refusing to engage in caring relationship. And the question is, does the patient who refuses to engage in caring relationship with the doctor reduce themselves to an object?
And yes, there's a danger in doing that. I think we need to be a little bit careful on the kind of action we're talking about. So I was reading recently about caring by bathing, people being washed. And certainly some of those who were being washed wanted what's in the literature sometimes called is cold care, rather than emotionally engaging care. They wanted the person who was to wash them to come in very formally, minimal conversation, minimal interaction, and they felt far more comfortable with that particular kind of act. So there might be some contexts in which a more detached style is in a way more caring. You can imagine so that sort of intimate washing, somebody wanting that to be that more detached care. But there, that's a choice. That's going to be the most caring way to look after the person, is to act in this more detached way. And so I wouldn't see anything wrong in that particular kind of example. But there'll be other contexts where someone just sort of says, "Oh, just treat me however you want." Yes, they're reducing themselves to an object and not taking care of the person who's providing the care.
Okay, we ran out of time for this Q&A. So now we will again have a short break, 10-minute long. So we'll connect back in at 5:10 of Rome time, so in 10 minutes, and we will continue with session number 3, which is titled Translating an Ethics of Love in the Medical Practice. So we'll see you soon. Hi, everyone. So welcome back to the third session of today, and the very last session of today, which is titled Translating an Ethics of Love in the Medical Practice. Our very first speaker will be Dr. Benedict Douglas from Durham University, with his presentation on love as a human right in medical treatment.
Hello, thank you. And yeah, thank you to Katerina and Serena for organizing this fantastic conference. So, in this paper, I will look at the place and the nature of love as a human right in the context of medical treatment. Although I will accept that medical care is possible without a feeling of emotion of love towards the patient, and I will also accept that there is no human right to be loved by anyone, I will suggest that human rights require that in the treatment of patients, the patient's relationships of love be respected and protected for 2 reasons. Firstly, to enable the patient to maintain or regain their sense of self. And secondly, to enable the patient, to make decisions on their treatment. So first up, to do this, we have to define love. Luckily, human beings have been doing this pretty much ever since we've been able to write, and probably before. There's probably a cave painting we'll find somewhere which has a great depiction of what love is. I look forward to seeing that. The definition I've used in my work has been that of Martha Nussbaum, the one that she arrives at after her survey of literature and music from Plato to Joyce, and which our Italian participants will be delighted to hear includes the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri. And the definition that Martha Nussbaum argues is implicit within these different works on love has 2 parts. It is a desire for togetherness, which affirms the identities of the lover and the beloved. So the first part, that desire for togetherness, arises from our nature as social beings. We fulfill it in many different ways: romantically, obviously, fraternally, filially, maternally, paternally, with our families. In our work with our students and colleagues, with our friends at dinner, and so on. This desire is something we feel deeply, and I'm sure the pandemic has shown us how deeply we feel this need to be together when the necessary restrictions keep us apart. So the second part of this definition, so we have this desire for togetherness, and the second part of the definition is that this desire affirms the identity of the lover and the beloved. And this is what distinguishes it, this emotion of love, from other emotions or relationships such as ownership or control. Who we as individuals love is a consequence of our personal history and our values. What society recognizes and protects as love is a judgment which reflects the values of morality of that society. So Dante in the Divine Comedy can be seen to be applying or perhaps critiquing an idea of love grounded in a morality of duty under which only those who obey God are loved by him. I actually prefer the interpretation which suggests that we sort of separate ourselves off from God's love by choosing not to love him. So, but as you see, the moral basis that you adopt determines how you understand or what you understand as love. The morality increasingly agreed to be at the core of human rights law is one which recognizes and protects the individual as a being capable of choosing how to live and through so choosing to manifest or define their identity. The European Court of Human Rights in the Pretty versus UK case said that self-determination runs like a thread through the convention as a whole. But despite this basis, this individualistic basis in the individual, human rights do not view individuals as these atomistic, solipsistic beings. Human rights recognize that we are relational beings. At a most fundamental level, the statement of human rights is a recognition that we live as part of a community where our interests and choices conflict. Most rights are not stated in absolute terms, recognizing that our choices can be limited to protect those of others. More substantively, Article 3 of the European Convention, which prohibits torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, encompasses, in some cases, solitary confinement, seeing that as amounting to inhuman treatment, recognizing that the relational part of our nature. Rights to marry or have relationships recognized by law have increasingly been recognized by the European Court. So human rights law recognizes and protects our relationships as a central part of our nature, of our individual identities. So what are the implications of the recognition and protection of love by human rights in the context of medical care? Under the conception of love protected by human rights, there is no right, I think, to be loved by a particular person. That would be incompatible with the basis of human rights and the conception of love they protect in the ability of the individual to choose how to live and who to love. This has perhaps not always been the case. Within British law, relationships have been historically defined in terms of duties. Only this year, the law changed so that prior to the change this year, you couldn't enter marriage at law simply because you felt you no longer loved the other person. You had to prove some breach of duty. So yes, this idea of choice at the basis of human rights. As Jonathan Herring has argued in his book on care and the law, good care is possible without an attitude and emotion of love between the carer and the person being cared for. I found his argument that caring is a reciprocal relationship really compelling. The idea that a relationship of care, the person being cared for, is also in some way able to show care for the person responsible for that care. Jonathan argued that this reciprocity and relationality avoids the person being cared for becoming a passive recipient or object of care. But although love is, as I said, not, and as Jonathan said, not a necessary part of giving care, I think it is necessary in the medical encounter for the patient to maintain or regain their sense of self and to make competent decisions, because our relationships of love are a crucial part of our identity. My experience is that those providing medical treatment tend to understand this. A few years ago, I was run over by a bus and spent many weeks recovering in hospital. I completely recovered, although if I turn to the side, I'm actually two-dimensional. To begin with, being in hospital, I felt very much as an object. I was physically unable to move, and the delightfully strong painkillers made it impossible for me to think clearly. Looking back, I am surprised how much time my family and friends were allowed to spend with me in this very busy hospital. Obviously, it was important to them as they feared they might lose me, but to me, also their presence helped me make decisions during my recovery. It is perhaps unsurprising that research shows that those with loving relationships recover more quickly from addiction to drugs, although this is not always the case. The presence of loved ones in the medical encounter is important because it's only with their presence and support that we can be fully ourselves through their affirmation of our identity and our manifestation of our identity through our love for them. In my work on human dignity, so I do a lot of work on human dignity, and in hospital I was fascinated to hear the nurses and doctors in their conversations with each other talk in terms of the importance of the dignity of the patients. But in their practice, there seemed to me a deep unspoken understanding of the importance of the patient's loving relationships for the patients to recover their well-being. Human rights protect what it is to be human, our dignity and our relationality. I think they could be invoked to protect the place of our relationships in the medical encounter, not with the doctors and the nurses, but with our family, both because their presence is necessary in ourselves and also so we can make decisions. But protecting human rights is always a question of balance and the rights of different people. And we've seen this in the pandemic as we have gone without seeing our loved ones to protect others. We've seen limits on partners and being able to support people giving birth. Even sometimes we have seen that people cannot be present for the deaths of their loved ones. In that context, love from those treating us cannot be something required as a right. It can only, as always with love, be something hoped for and thankful for. Thank you.
Thank you. And for those watching, I'll just fill you in on Dr. Douglas's profile. He's an assistant professor of law at Durham Law School. Dr. Douglas, in his words, attempts to work out what it means to be human and what this means for how human rights laws should be understood and interpreted. He has a strong research interest in the areas of the role of love in human rights law and their judicial interpretation. For those watching us, again, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them through Q&A function and we'll get back to them later on in Q&A session. Our next speaker is also from Durham. Ms. Katarina Milo is a lecturer in law at Exeter Law School at the moment and PhD candidate in law at Durham Law School. She's associate researcher of the UNESCO chair and co-leader of the research group Dignity and Equity in Women's Health Issues. Her research interest is in the area of doctor-patient relationship, informed consent, and beginning of life ethics. And her presentation today is titled Love as a Journey, Informed Consent as an Act of Ongoing Love.
Thank you, Milena, for the nice introduction. And it's my pleasure to be the last speaker of a very long day, but I hope that you are still alive and you have still some energy left to listen to this presentation. So we heard a lot today about what does it mean for a woman to love and to be loved in a medical context. So I'll probably wrap up with my presentation, adding just something extra, which is an example that I will use from the informed consent literature. So basically, my presentation is titled Love as a Journey, and I will explore the informed consent literature in England and Wales and how this can be translated as a journey of love. So here's the overview. I'd like to start this presentation with a quote from Carol Wojtyla, which I think summarizes many of the things that have already been said today. And I want to read it. Love is never something ready-made, something merely given to men and women. It is always at the same time a task which they are set. Love should be seen as something which is, in a sense, never is, but is always becoming. And what it becomes depends upon the contribution of both persons and the depth of their commitment. So we have explored partially the importance of intention, especially with Charles Foster at the very beginning. The importance of relationality and contribution of both was something that we saw in Tana's presentation. Jonathan and Benedict was a common thread, let's say. What I want to add here is that this is a journey. This is not something, this is not a given, but is not a one-off event, and requires, in a certain sense, the willingness to embark upon it. So why am I using and I'm making reference to informed consent? So here's a quote from the Supreme Court judgment in Montgomery, which is the referral point when it comes to informed consent, can be seen as the referral point when it comes to informed consent in England and Wales. Basically, for those of you who are not familiar with the idea of informed consent, I know that the first reaction to informed consent is that, okay, here's your paper, can you please sign it? And off you go. Well, basically, the idea of informed consent, or at least the ideal, or an idealistic way of informed consent is way more than that. And I quite like this quote because it states the importance of recognizing patients as adults who are capable of understanding that medical treatment is uncertain of success and may involve risks, and they need to accept also the responsibility connected to this. So in a way, informed consent is a process and involves also this journey somehow. And it's an act formally of sharing information concerning risks, benefits, and alternatives. But as also Jonathan was saying, this is not just sharing of information. It's the willingness of embarking in something that is probably more than that. But let's just explore a bit possible principles behind informed consent. We have already touched upon this and the idea of relationality, and I'm talking here about partnership. In a sense, gone are the days of seeing the doctor as the one who knows and the patient is the one who is subject to someone else. But doctor and patient are both experts. They both carry a relevant expertise that we should hear. And in one sense, Montgomery and the Supreme Court judgment that I'm making reference to here emphasizes that there's still a contribution of the medical professional that we have to recognize. There's a so-called objective component of the disclosure of information process, which involves somehow medical information. So this is the expertise of clinicians. And also the fact that clinicians can and should share information independently of the magnitude of risks, and also independently from the fact that the patient is or is not asking questions about it. Charles mentioned the idea of a shared decision-making model. The idea of shared and mutuality reminds us that it's not all about the doctor, as I was saying, that there's something that the doctor has, but there's something else that the patient has got too. And so the patient is regarded as also a right holder, and autonomy, let's say, is another key principle behind informed consent. And a definition that Montgomery provides of this concept is the idea that patients are consumers exercising choices. I will go back to this in a second. It's not an uncontroversial definition, but the way in which I interpret it, and I know that many might disagree, is the idea that patient's voice needs to be heard. But the way in which we hear this voice is not in opposition to the clinician. Basically, it is possible that if we consider just patient as consumer and doctor as expert, it might be also possible that the outcome is that these two persons will never encounter. There will never be an encounter. I will be talking about my expertise as a clinician. The patient as consumer will be just there, asking, or in the worst case scenario, maybe pretending something from the doctor, but there's no desire or willingness to engage. a better definition of informed consent, and this is my interpretation of informed consent, which is shared not just by me, but also by professional guidelines, is that there should be a common thread between these two things. And the GMC guideline, the professional guideline in England and Wales, in this sense, do stress this aspect. And they say that they substitute the model of shared decision-making with the idea of supported decision-making. The problem with shared decision-making for some was that at the end of the day, we need mutually to agree on something. So let's say that Alberto is the doctor, I am the patient, we need to reach an agreement, and it has to be commonly agreed. There is no room for disagreement on Alberto's side, right, on what we are doing. But the idea of supported decision-making is the idea that, again, we recognize the vulnerability of the patient as much as we recognize the vulnerabilities of the doctor and try to balance these two. Okay, surely this is easier said than done, but the theory behind that is at least this. So I'm here translating and trying to apply informed consent in the women's reproductive sphere. And my area of expertise is informed consent in the context of abortion. So abortion has been stressed as an informed decision-making process. So it has been stressed many times that information matters here, that somehow prior to any decision, it is important that there's a journey, a decision-making process that also comes in. And this is something that the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists also recognized. And also Lady Hale in the judgment in Montgomery says that we should not, and this is a stereotype to consider women just because they are pregnant, unable to make a decision. The purpose of informed consent is not to consider the patient as unable to make a decision. The purpose of informed consent is and should be to journey and to support the patient, to provide relevant information. But these information are to be tailored according to the expertise of the clinician, plus the needs and the values of the woman as well. So this, again, the importance of information is something that is stressed also by NICE more recently, and it says that pregnant women should be offered evidence-based information and support to enable them to make informed decisions about their care and treatment. And yes, so in theory, it's all good, it's all fine, but there are challenges, or at least what I understand to be challenges in this context. We have seen this happening a lot before the pandemic, but also, as I will show you in a bit, during the pandemic. There's a pressure that is inspired by aspects like what Tana was saying, the need to, we have short time, there's a long waiting list of people, and we need to guarantee access to a legal service, right? So how do we balance the importance of access to a service that is recognized as legal in a system? So I'm not challenging whether this should or should not be legal. I'm saying that given that it's legal in this context, how do we balance the involvement of clinicians with this push towards access? When this push towards access leads us to say that we should reduce medical involvement. And this is something that, again, can jeopardize, in my understanding, informed consent. And I will explain you why. So I'm here providing an example of the COVID-19 and abortion framework. In March 2020, home was recognized as a class of places where an early term medical abortion could take place. Before, this happened in England and Wales and also in Scotland. Before that, only part of the procedure could happen at home. So after that, it was fully possible for this procedure to happen at home, provided that there was an e-consultation with the clinician and the pills were shipped by post. In his recent guidelines, RICOG 2020 has prioritized access in a COVID-19 context, recognizing that things like lockdown and the impossibility to physically go to the clinic justified the reduction of medical involvement. However, the same guideline does recognize that informed consent is vital and women must be given enough information and enough time. So the question that I'm asking myself is that how do we manage this enough information and time? And following also along the lines of what Tana was saying, the importance of presence, with this priority of reduction of medical involvement and prioritizing only one aspect of informed consent, which is the protection of patients as rights holder. So basically, what I think are the challenges connected to the use of telemedicine. Telemedicine is a great tool to enhance access. We know that for many people who have access barriers related because of the geographical areas in which they are, telemedicine can be a way to overcome this obstacle. However, there are also cons in my understanding. One is related to the fact that, I'm starting from the second point here, and it's related to the issue of vulnerability that also Jonathan was touching upon. And this is there's already a study that shows that telemedicine can be tricky, especially for those patients who are in a situation of domestic abuse, for instance, or are experiencing any sort of vulnerability. So what I mean is that oftentimes telemedicine is understood as a phone call or a video call, but is often left to the discretion of the clinician. We don't know if this is a long Zoom call, if it's a quick chat on via phone, if the clinician actually has this chat or it's completely delegated to other parties and he only gets this information indirectly. This is something that we don't know. And another thing that I found it interesting, this is a pre-COVID-19 studies that was saying that telemedicine is a great tool, yes, but only for subsequent medical encounter, not for the very first medical encounter, which means that the medical encounter, which is made up of presence, made up of relationship, and made up also of trust, requires also to prioritize, when possible, face-to-face encounters. So this is something that can be also jeopardized here. However, I do recognize that time is a double-edged sword, because for some, especially for those who have a gradualist approach when it comes to respect of the life of the fetus, they say that, okay, the more the pregnancy proceeds, the worse it is, because there's there's also a greater risks when it comes to practicing an abortion itself, because it is also recognized that the more late term is an abortion, the stronger are the risks involved in this. Plus, and this is something that I'm not mentioning, but is also there's something related to the risk of not necessarily having a timely ultrasound, which is connected to the fact that there might be a risk connected to, for instance, ectopic pregnancies that, though minor, can arise. So in all, what I want to say is that though case law and Montgomery in particular recognizes that informed consent is vital, and it is, in my understanding, also a patient's right, and involves two things, which are the relevance of hearing patient voice, hearing the patient needs, but also involves partnership and presence of the clinician. This is something that we have not seen necessarily happening in the abortion context, and especially in the COVID-19 context. I'm aware and I know that circumstances of extreme necessity can justify a different approach, but I think that professional guidelines should somehow be careful, especially as we move, hopefully, in a post-lockdown and hopefully also in a post-pandemic context. So possible ways for wars, possible food for thought at the end of the day. I don't have necessarily a solution. But what I'm saying is that the progressive reduction of medical involvement and forms of telemedicine, when these also involve the fact that there's the lack, for instance, of a face-to-face encounter, can jeopardize also informed consent. because they can prioritize an aspect, which is access to the service, while also risking neglecting another key aspect. I think that more research needs to be done on the impact of telemedicine and informed consent. And yes, circumstances of necessity can justify an exceptional approach, but unfortunately, I would like to add that the reduction of medical involvement has not been just an exceptional decision for exceptional times. We have seen this happening before, and we also see a push towards its use also afterwards. So, in all, I think that for clinicians, to love women means to journey with the patient in an ongoing act of care for them. To care for them means to be present, as Tana was saying, to listening to them, share with them relevant risks and benefits and alternatives, and also to listen to their voice. At the same time, again, informed consent can reflect this journey, can be an act of love, provided that we give relevance to not just patients' needs and patients' values, but also we give relevance to the medical encounter. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move to Q&A. The very first question is for Katarina. Is abortion different from other medical procedures? In other procedures, the medical issues will be a key, but in abortion, it's often personal, religious, relational factors which influence a patient, meaning the role of doctors is less significant.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would firstly say, let's assume that is exactly the same as any other medical treatment. If it's exactly the same, we are adopting a double standard, in the sense that in other medical treatment, we consider informed consent to be vital, but we have a different approach sometimes when it comes to abortion. However, I do consider to be abortion significatively different, and I do recognize that there's also a social and a personal aspect involved in all this. This is absolutely undeniable. But at the same time, I don't think that the way ahead is about erasing completely the role of clinicians. What I argue in my work is that it is important not to demedicalize, but to better medicalize, so to reconsider the way in which we involve the clinician. It should not be like the scenario that Tana was mentioning, like I need to go through this and we have these 20 minutes, and once I'm done with these 20 minutes, that means that I've been a good doctor. It is about doing something more, probably. Sometimes we require just a few minutes, other times we require more, but you cannot have any a priori assumption. So this is my fear, that often we reason with a priori assumptions when it comes to the relevance or not of clinician in this context. Also because, to be honest, patients can refuse informed consent. They can say, I don't want to receive information. It's their right to refuse. Montgomery does recognize that there's a right not to know. Nobody takes issue with that. But the problem is that, do we recognize that for some, I don't know, I'm not doing empirical work necessarily myself, but that at least for some, it is important, that presence. It is important that someone is there listening. And I quite like, sorry for the very long reply, but I quite like what McLean used to say. We should never confuse autonomy with abandonment. When autonomy only portrays the image of a self-sufficient and, a self-sufficient human being, that means that we are neglecting those who don't feel empowered, those who don't feel like, that they're acting out of choice, but they have no choice but to. So maybe this is a minority argument and this is a minority position, but I think that we should hear the voice of those who oftentimes don't get a voice, and especially those most vulnerable, I would say.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Douglas. You talk about love as human right. And if I heard you correctly, you don't believe there's a duty to love. Can there be a human right without corresponding duty?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So yes, I think I see what you mean. I would say that, and you did hear correctly, I don't think that there is a duty to love. And I do think that there's a human right to love. The way I make those consistent is in terms of the nature of the human right to love. So it would be a right not to have your relationship interfered with, to have your relationship respected, but not to be provided with one. And I think that follows from a conception of love, which recognizes us as choosing beings, as autonomous beings. So I don't think there's an inconsistency there. I think you can have a human right to love and to have love respected without a corresponding duty. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question. I hope so.
Thank you. Okay, Professor Garcia.
To claim that love is a right is really, I would say, hazardous. It's like a challenge. Why? Because by nature, I would say, love goes, in my opinion, beyond justice. Otherwise, the risk is that to think that everything that is good in this life has to be a right or a duty, legally speaking. But I think that in order to make human grow, for the human flourishing, there's a world that is much more interesting and beautiful than law, than rights and duties. And I would say the horizon of happiness needs not mere law, but needs ethics, needs solidarity, needs charity, needs love, need tenderness. Otherwise, we risk to think that the state and the politicians have to regulate even how we make love with our wife or our spouses, or our husband. And this is not part of the mission of the state and the government. They have to create conditions for the people to live, to survive, and then to make them flourish. The more ethics will be in the world, I think, better is. The less regulations and law exist, better is. Because laws should work for the common good, for the peace, the social cohesion, but not try to invade areas where human flourishing requires freedom, generosity, love, reciprocity, not by duty, in the sense legal duty, but like a moral duty of doing good thing for the others.
I would agree to put, look, love comes before law and is something beyond law. I think that law is how we regulate our society. I'm not sure I'd be comfortable with law regulating love, but I think it has a role in the way that all human rights have in ensuring its respect and its protection. But yeah, I can understand the discomfort with regulation, and perhaps this is the question of the extent of sort of positive rights and negative rights. But yeah,
yes, because to the extent that the law and the state creates conditions for the well-being of the people, then the people will think more about others, about solidarity, about love. to some extent. If they have to think how to feed them because they are hungry, they are poor, in that context, it's more difficult also to go beyond your fundamental needs. If those fundamental needs are covered, if your country is in peace, there is a kind of social cohesion, so that people can think about other things, love, art. It was fantastic what at the beginning it was explained about the role of music and how also the art can contribute to the good of people, how art can inspire people to justice, yes, but also to love to some extent. But yeah.
No, thank you.
We have two more questions for Katarina. So first one, I'm not certain why medication abortion has to be conceived as needing medical supervision, particularly decision-making. There's a very good argument that movement away from medicine to self-administration is an act of love because it's respecting women, often to make their choices before they seek treatment as such. And as such, in reality, doctors and nurses are merely gatekeeping rather than helping to make decisions based on patient values. So what's your take on it?
Yes, thank you, Claire, for your question, and you're always spot on. So, and thank you because you give me the opportunity to just clarify this point. So you are right in when it comes to safety, and yes, early-term medical abortion, it is a safe procedure. But what I'm arguing for is not about safety. I'm arguing for a role that clinician can play, which goes beyond safety. So, and probably the key aspect is that I won't consider clinicians as mere gatekeepers, but I would recognize them as something more. Again, I rely on, you probably are already familiar with this, but there's also, on top of what you said, evidence that telemedicine is somehow, I'm here quoting, but yeah, it's basically somehow also underplaying and is somehow leaving aside also those who are experiencing a vulnerability. So it is possible that, and I'm not denying that, face-to-face encounter for some are not relevant, but what I take issue with is the fact that we are portraying this mainstream idea that telemedicine is all everyone needs, right? And instead, at least we should have a more kind of flexible approach whereby at least there's an opportunity for a face-to-face medical encounter. Because face-to-face medical encounter is also, but not only, about safety, and can be a good way to starting a relationship with the patient. Informed consent, as I was saying, I don't intend it to be just a matter of sharing, signing a document, signing a notification form in the case of abortion, and off you go. In that case, for me, that one is not informed consent at all. It's not even, probably is not even consent, but I will leave it aside. But again, should be something more. And in order for this to happen, I would rely on what was said before. So the importance of things like presence. Jonathan was talking about shedding tears and shedding fears. So again, yes, in terms of making sure that the procedure goes well, I can somehow agree with you, even though it is possible that something can go wrong. But let's assume that safety is okay. Still, informed consent is more than safety, and the role of clinician can be and should be more than safety. Why do I think that cannot happen via phone or via video? Again, I don't think that it cannot happen in any case. I just think that if we need to talk about an ought to be scenario, I think it's important to recognize the importance of presence and the importance of face-to-face encounters, because telemedicine, I do recognize, is a great tool for access. It's a great tool for people who are far away from medical practices, and that's okay. But what about all the rest, what I was saying before, those who feel that you were mentioning the fact that they were making a choice before. What about those who didn't, who probably are a minority? Yes, but we don't just care about the majority, I hope.
Thank you. So you answered both questions.
And you-
Are there any other questions from the panelists? We covered all the questions from the participants. In which case we could wrap up if there are no more questions.
I just want to mention that a good study is the FSRH consultation response, capturing, I'm not going to type it down, where actually this aspect of the challenges connected with virtual consultation and the lack of face-to-face encounter is highlighted. I don't know if Serena can allow me to post something to, or I can do that. I think that I can do probably. Sorry. Hold
Yeah,
on
I think
a
it's
sec.
open now, the chat function.
Yeah. I mean this one.
Okay, are there any more comments or additions anyone wants to add? Perfect. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you especially to all our panelists that presented today. We really hope you enjoyed the day. Just to repeat, this event was brought to you by UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights in Rome in collaboration with Ateneo Pontificio Regina Apostolorum University, University of Princeton, and European University in Rome. So we thank you all for taking part in today's webinar, and we wish you all a pleasant weekend.
Yeah, and thank you very much also to Professor Tana de Campos and Caterina Milo that have been working hard for this event, and especially also for Serena Montefusco that you don't see, but has been working behind to make all the technical aspects and all the dissemination of the event possible. So I hope that this is the first and not the last of the events of this group of research on dignity and equity in women's health issues. Have a nice weekend, have a nice Sunday, and God bless you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye all. Thank you. Bye.